Chapter 140. Feng Wei did not want to continue being suppressed by the other party's aura. He changed the topic and said, "It's a pity that the Academy of Sciences hasn't fully understood the laws of the two worlds. Otherwise, they could directly transport armored troops and intercontinental missiles over and flatten this continent. Unlike now, everything that comes here has become a pile of scrap metal, and we have to rebuild and research it here according to the laws of physics of this world." The young lady shook her head, her gaze unfathomable. "Feng Wei, don't underestimate the people of this mainland. I have to admit that their development of the human body is far ahead of ours. If it wasn't for the help of the evil gods, we wouldn't have been able to surpass them in this aspect. Furthermore, the laws of the two realms were extremely profound. The further one went into the microscopic level, the greater the difference between the two realms. It wasn't that I was looking down on those lunatics from the Academy of Sciences, but I was afraid that they wouldn't be able to transport something like a nuclear bomb over for the next few hundred years. Moreover, even if we have nuclear warheads, we might not be able to do anything to those divine-level experts. If they were to charge into Earth and start a massacre, even those few mage kings would have a headache." Just as the young girl said these words, Feng Wei's gaze froze. On the blurry black and white image on the simple electronic screen, a man holding a long sword slowly floated down to the ground. "This guy looks so familiar. Feng Xingjian?" Hearing Feng Wei's words, the girl's eyes narrowed. She was like a tiger that had just woken up, exuding a strong, murderous intent. "Are you sure this is Feng Xingjian?" Feng Wei said hesitantly. "They do look similar, but their auras are different. Their looks have also changed slightly. However, Carolyn of the Onassis clan should have already killed Feng Xingjian. Why is he here?" The girl said coldly. "It seems that not only did he not die, but he also had a fortuitous encounter and obtained the Empire's knight inheritance. He was indeed a bastard child of the otherworldly people. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to learn martial skills. It was because of this person's cowardice that my younger brother was chosen to become Feng Xingqian's apostle. I have nothing to say about Feng Xingqian having the aptitude to become a mage. Therefore, I had originally planned to personally bring my younger brother back after I reached the deity realm. But now that I've met this Feng Xingjian, I'll bring him back home and let the old granny deal with him. This is also a merit." The old granny had been wary, suppressed, and even chased out of the family for a long time. The old granny had been wary and even chased them out. She had even been chased out of the Feng family. She also knew how furious the old mistress had been after what had happened to Feng Xingjian. If she could capture Feng Xingjian back, she would immediately be able to gain a greater say in the Feng clan, a higher status, and more cultivation resources. Moreover, if Feng Xingjian had not run away, why would her younger brother have been sent to become Feng Xingqian's apostle? The power of Feng apostles to Feng Xings. That the young of sex to the young brother. The Feng brother was the two. As Feng Wei spoke, streams of air currents seethed around the young lady, letting out faint roars of tigers and dragons. Feng Wei shouted, "Feng Qian, we're not allowed to fight in this mission. If you make a move and are discovered by the Empire, it might threaten our overall plan." At the same time, the image of Feng Xingjian performing boundaries negation was displayed. The next moment, the image disappeared and changed to another view. It was the two Garcia warriors who had died. Feng Qian's eyes were brimming with confidence. He was injured even when killing great warriors. His abilities are at most at the pinnacle of the first transition. It'll be as easy as slaughtering a chicken or a sheep for me to capture him. How will I be discovered? Moreover, this person is quite lucky. Not only did he not die, he even learned the Empire's legacy. If we capture him and hand him over to the old granny, it'll be a great merit. At the end of her words, her aura soared up into the sky. Even the clouds in the sky seemed to have faintly broken a small hole. "Feng Wei, control the surveillance system and see where he's heading to." Feng Wei shook his head helplessly. This is just an experimental product created by the Academy of Science to adapt to Miracle World's laws of physics. Right now, we can only check in real time. There's no way to backtrack or even contact him. We can only try our luck and see if any other great warriors have met him. Fang Xingjian, who was at the other side, was still unaware that some of his acquaintances were also staring at him. He continued to advance, and about an hour later, he saw some footprints. He squatted down to take a look and realized that they were the prints of armor. The standards of the Garcia people are extremely low. These armors should be left behind by the Empire's knights. Thinking of this, he looked around the surroundings and found other traces. Therefore, he continued to pursue, and the number of traces increased. However, just as he arrived under a big tree, four silhouettes suddenly appeared and surrounded him. "Ha! Tai Long, I told you that someone would definitely follow the traces here. Your armor is too heavy." The one who spoke was a skinny guy. Although he was wearing a knight attire, he still exuded an unconcealable wretched aura. The person whom he addressed as Tai Long was a knight who was completely covered in a set of heavy armor. Hearing that, he shouted, "Who are you? Why are you following us? Is there even a need to ask?" "He's obviously a knight." A green-haired female knight smiled. Looking at the disheveled Fang Xingjian, she said, "Lad, which academy are you from? Have you been separated from your teammates?" On the other side, a knight who was completely covered in black threw a few glances at Fang Xingjian. Feeling that he was not a threat, he jumped onto a branch and started to stand guard. Fang Xingjian threw a glance at the four of them and said, "I'm from Cursed Royal Academy. Who are you guys?" "Oh, Cursed people? We're from Roshander Royal Academy." The green-haired lady smiled. "Cursed is really in the limelight this time around. Do you know that guy by the name of Hamel? He single-handedly killed 7 Black Devils. Seems like there's hope for him in the next regional selection." Fang Xingjian shook his head. "I've rushed all the way here, and I'm not too sure about the situation. Do you guys have any backup weapons?" The wretched-looking skinny man smiled, took out a long sword from the pouch on his back, and tossed it to Fang Xingjian, saying, "Lad, it hasn't been long since you transitioned, right? How dare you act so recklessly when you're alone? From the looks of it, you must have suffered a lot." Fang Xingjian waved his long sword casually, not answering the other party's question. Instead, he asked, "Where are you guys heading to next? Have those Garcia people successfully retreated?" "Not yet," the green-haired lady said. "They've been suppressed by us and are now retreating at full speed towards Kremlin Gulf. We're pressing forward on all fronts and gathering at that gulf. I heard that General Alipaz is planning to wipe them out completely there." Alipaz was the Western Garrison's commander-in-chief, as well as the person with the highest authority in this battle. At the same time, he was also the man who had been secretly invited by Huang Lin to guide Fang Xingjian in his waves. Seeing that Fang Xingjian did not say anything, the green-haired lady looked at him again. After seeing the burns on his body and the dusty night attire, she shook her head and said, "Forget it. You can come with us. If you continue charging forward alone, you'll be eaten up by those Black Devils." Black Robe, who had been standing guard on the tree, said unhappily, "We don't have time to take care of a newbie. He'll slow us down." The green-haired female knight smiled and said, "He's considered outstanding for being able to charge all the way here alone. He shouldn't be a burden." Black Robe let out a helpless sigh, looked at Fang Xingjian and said, "Lad, if you're a burden to us, we won't stay behind to wait for you." Fang Xingjian said calmly, "Same here." With a sweep of his long sword, he threw away the broken sword from earlier and sheathed his new sword. Throwing a glance at the 4 people in front of him, Fang Xingjian was currently injured and was not familiar with the path to Kremlin Gulf. Moreover, if they were to continue moving forward, they would probably encounter more and more Black Devils. It was indeed time for him to temporarily join a small team of knights. The green-haired female knight smiled. "All right then, let's go quickly. If we're late, it might be over. I haven't killed enough Black Devils." Chapter 141. Along the way, Fang Xingjian slowly got to know the identities of these 4 knights. They were all from Roshander Royal Academy and were level 19 knights who had transitioned 5 years ago. The green-haired lady was about 28 or 29 years old and was the leader of this small team. Her name was Rhea, and she was skilled in archery. She always had a gentle smile on her face, but the other 3 never disobeyed her orders. The muscular man dressed in metal armor was called Tai Long, and he was skilled in wielding a pair of axes. His strength attribute was over 80 points, and when he dashed around in his armor, he was like a human tank. The wretched-looking and skinny guy was called Glenn. He was skilled in covert operations, assassinations, and spies. His agility was about 85 points, about the same as Fong Xingjian's current performance after his injuries. The last black-robed man, who had always looked down on Fong Xingjian as a burden, was called Wei Longzi. Although Fong Xingjian had never seen his true face under the black robe, from his name, he should be a Westerner with black hair and black eyes. Wei Longzi's close combat battle prowess should be the strongest among the four knights. Therefore, he had been following the team for a long time to scout the surroundings. They did not ask for Fong Xingjian's name, perhaps because Fong Xingjian was just a newbie to them. Of course, if they did not ask, it was impossible for Fong Xingjian to take the initiative to bring it up. As they were getting closer and closer to Kremlin Gulf, they could encounter enemies at any time. Therefore, Fong Xingjian's team of 5 was getting more and more cautious, and their speed of advancement was getting slower and slower. However, although they had seen many signs of battles along the way, they had yet to encounter any enemies. Despite being so vigilant and having such high concentration of mental energy, advancing forward still consumed a lot of energy and stamina. Looking at Fong Xingjian, who was covered in injuries but was still able to keep up with him, the wretched-looking and skinny Glenn smiled and said, "Not bad, kid. You can still keep up with us. However, don't force yourself. If you can't keep up, just tell us. We can also take a break." Fong Xingjian did not say anything. He only focused on circulating his muscles, qi, and blood. Through the internal circulation of his force, he activated the specialties internal healing and internal training. Together with his elementary berserk physique, he sped up the recovery of his injuries. The other 3 glanced at Fong Xingjian. They felt that his performance was quite good. For a newly advanced knight to be able to keep up with him despite being injured, he could be considered quite outstanding. Even so, they still did not regard Fong Xingjian as a true combatant. After all, not everyone could surpass time. Other than a small number of demonic geniuses, most of the newly transitioned knights were far from being a match for the veterans. In their opinion, a novice knight like Fong Xingjian, who had suffered so many injuries just by coming here, would probably be lucky if he could fight a great warrior. Of course, they were too embarrassed to say it out loud. They just decided that if they were to fight later and the situation wasn't critical, they would take care of each other. After advancing carefully for about 2 hours, the green-haired lady, Rhea, suddenly stopped. With a wave of her hand, everyone else came to a stop. She squatted down, looked at the bloodstains on the ground, and said, "It's fresh. You guys stay here. I'll go up and take a look." With that, she jumped up and rapidly climbed up to the top of a nearby tree like an agile monkey. Then, the color of her eyes changed slightly, and she scanned the situation within a range of several thousand meters. At the next moment, 3 fleeing figures appeared in her field of vision. She darted down abruptly, landed on the ground, and said, "There are people escaping here. They're knights. Let's go and provide support quickly." With that, she darted out first, with Fong Xingjian and the others following closely behind. Rhea continued, "Wei Longzi, you'll be at the front to provide cover. Tai Long, you'll be at the back. Grand, you'll follow me. Rookie, you'll be in the middle to provide support." She spoke very quickly, but by the time she finished, the black-robed man, Wei Longzi, had already run to the front, acting as the vanguard. The wretched-looking Grand was by Rhea's side to protect her, while Tai Long, who was in full armor, was at the back. The reason why Fong Xingjian was arranged to be in the middle to provide support was naturally because he was not strong enough, and so he was allowed to stay in the safest place. Although it was not said out loud, it was clear that Fong Xingjian had taken care of him. Fong Xingjian was not annoyed. If others were treating him well and taking care of him, what was there to be angry about? He continued to focus on recuperating. To him, every second that he could recover his strength earlier was a good thing. The 5 of them advanced at high speed, and 1 minute later, they bumped into the 3 fleeing people. The three knights were all men, and when the one in the lead saw Fang Xingjian, his eyes lit up. "Xingjian, you're here." With a soft swoosh, an arrow pierced through where the three of them were. Reyes said coldly, "Wait a moment. Tell me your identities first." The knight who had just called out Xingjian's name shouted, "I'm Cursed Academy's Jack." As for the other two knights, one of them had a full beard, while the other had a bald head without a single strand of eyebrows. Both of them were from Green Jade Royal Academy. The one with the full beard was called Duprat, while the bald one was called Wales. Rhea turned to look at Fang Xingjian and said, "You know that Jack?" Fang Xingjian nodded and said, "I do. He's from the same class as me." Hearing that, Rhea nodded as well, temporarily acknowledging the trio's identities. She then asked, "How did the three of you end up together? Where are the others? Why are you guys fleeing? Is there anyone chasing after you?" Jack hurriedly said, "We were originally a 17-man team from 2 academies, but we were attacked by those black devils. The one leading them is their destined warrior, Mamukia. He's still chasing after us. The instructor stayed behind to stop him, but we don't know what's going on." Although Mamukia was only a level 20 destined warrior, he was, after all, a second transition knight. The threat he posed was not something that ordinary knights could compare to. Hearing Jack's words, the other knights were all shocked. The difference between a second transition and a first transition was like the difference between a first transition and a zero transition. It was almost incomprehensible. Fang Xingjian's pupils contracted a little as well. However, thinking of how he was still injured, he closed his eyes once again and tried his best to recuperate. Rhea gave it some thought and said, "Mamukia is a warrior who specializes in speed. We have to hurry. This is how we should proceed from now on." Just as the few of them were discussing the path they should take, how they could avoid Mamukia's pursuit, and how they could get close to the Empire's main forces, Jack walked up to Fang Xingjian. He looked at Xingjian's body and asked, "Xingjian, you're injured?" Fang Xingjian nodded with his eyes closed. Jack fell silent for a moment, revealing an unprecedented struggle in his eyes. He took in a deep breath and slowly took out a bag of medicinal ointment from his bag. He smiled and said, "Xingjian, this is the healing ointment provided by the Netherworld Valley. It's as famous as their poison. Use it. It can speed up the recovery of your injuries." Fang Xingjian opened his eyes, took a look at the ointment, and said, "All right." Jack then helped Fang Xingjian apply the healing ointment. The moment the ointment was applied, Fang Xingjian felt a cooling sensation permeating through his body. It was as if the wounds all over his body were being massaged by countless little hands, and he could feel that his injuries were recovering at a faster rate. Jack clenched his fists slightly. Looking at Fang Xingjian, who had closed his eyes and was recuperating, a strong sense of guilt flashed in his eyes. Chapter 142. On the day when the war broke out and the Western Garrison Army requested for reinforcements, Jack had specially applied for leave and returned to Curse City, returning to his home. He stood outside the familiar little wooden house, looking at the warm sunlight coming from within. Thinking of his daughter and wife, the corners of his lips curled up into a blissful smile. Opening the door, he walked in. "Alice, father is back." "You guys," the next moment, when he turned the corner of the door and looked at the hall in his house, the expression on his face suddenly became extremely stiff. Countess, who was dressed in red robes, was smiling as he sat on a chair. In his arms, the adorable Alice was in a deep sleep, looking like a sleeping cat. Jack's wife was kneeling by the side, trembling all over, her face filled with terror. When she saw that Jack had returned, tears flowed out from her eyes. Looking at Jack's stiff body, Countess smiled, stroked Alice's head, and said, "Jack, it's been a long time." By now, Jack had already calmed down and said coldly, "Countess, what are you trying to do?" Countess smiled, his finger brushing past Alice's fair little face. "I just want to see how much you love your wife and daughter," Jack said coldly. Attacking another knight's family and threatening them is a great taboo in the association. The entire Treja clan will be shamed because of your actions. Is that so? Countess smiled. "But I can sacrifice the entire Treja clan for myself. But can you sacrifice such an adorable daughter and wife for yourself? As he spoke, Countess's finger brushed past slightly, and Alice's little finger fell to the ground. In her sleep, her brows furrowed. However, it was unknown what Countess had done, but despite the pain, she did not wake up. No, his wife, who was at the side, suddenly cried out in shock. Countess then slapped her across the air, causing her to fall to the ground. Her vision was blurred by tears as she looked at Countess in fear and panic. Jack, who was at the side, pounced forward with a loud bang, but was caught by Countess's reduced force field. Countess, who had attained great mastery in the infernal, indestructible physique and had converted his human and dragon bloodlines, was not someone Jack could go up against. Looking at Jack, who was struggling in midair like a pinched frog, his wife knelt on the ground and cried out, "Please, please let us go, please." Countess shook his finger and looked at Jack, whose face was ashen like a wild beast. He said, "Don't be so agitated. It's just a finger, but if you don't listen carefully to what I'm going to say next, it won't be just a finger." Jack forced himself to calm down, then stared at Countess and said, "What on earth do you want?" "Just a few small things." Countess handed a packet of ointment to Jack with a smile and said, "After you guys go to the battlefield, if you meet Feng Xingjian, you have to use this on him." Jack was slightly startled and said angrily, "Don't even think about it." Countess did not say anything. He only moved his finger slightly and slid it across Alice's arm, leaving behind a long line of blood. "No." His wife knelt on the ground, looking like she was on the verge of breaking down. She covered her mouth with both hands and cried silently. Jack's muscles and vital energy and blood swelled up abruptly, his reduced force field exploding at full power. However, the power transmitted by Countess was like a huge mountain, suppressing him, making it hard for him to move. Countess said calmly, "Jack, I'm not joking. Or do you think that there's still a way to turn the situation around? Feng Xingjian is someone whom the first prince has his eyes on, and the first prince is the future ruler of the world. Do you think that something which he has his eyes on will be able to escape? There are only two possibilities for me to come here today. One is that you've agreed to it and become the first prince's man from now on. Your whole family will be blessed and have a meteoric rise. The other is that I'll kill all of you, and your daughter and wife will suffer the most terrible revenge before they die. Which one will you choose? Which one will you choose?" With that, Countess smiled again and shook his finger, saying, "Jack, you don't have a choice. The weak have never had a choice when facing the strong." With that, he carried Alice in one hand and Jack's wife in the other, walking slowly into the shadows. "If you leak the secret, they'll die. If you tell the academy, they'll die. If you meet Feng Xingjian and he didn't drug them, they'll still die. If you do anything that's disadvantageous to us, they'll all die. And it won't just be a simple death. They'll be sold to the dirtiest brothels and humiliated by the poorest and lowest laborers. In the end, they'll become a pile of rotten meat that even dogs won't care about, and they'll be thrown into the smelly gutters of the slums. Jack, don't think of trying to deceive everyone. The first prince's influence isn't something you can imagine. Your classmates, your teachers, and even the academy's upper echelon. There are too many of our people. Jack, you have no other choice." Jack tried his best to chase after them, but the moment he lifted his foot, he was pressed down to the ground by a terrifying force. He knelt on the ground and could only watch as his wife and child disappeared into the endless darkness. The muscles throughout his body kept on expanding and being suppressed, and the muscles and bones in his body kept on getting injured due to this struggle. There are professionals who check on Feng Xingjian's diet and medicinal cuisine. They won't give me the chance to drug them. His body trembled as he looked in the direction where Countess had disappeared, bellowing out with a face filled with madness and pain. "Haha, don't worry. As long as the war starts, you'll have plenty of chances." As he spoke, a piece of paper that emitted a sulfuric smell landed before Jack. Countess's voice carried a strange, bewitching power as it entered Jack's ears. Jack said in astonishment, "The Devil's Note? Haha, do you think that you're qualified to sign the Devil's Note?" Countess said in disdain, This is a purgatory contract personally made by the first prince. If you sign it, we'll know immediately after you drug them. At the same time, if you leak the secret, we'll know as well. But the battlefield is so big, I won't be able to find him. Sign the contract, and we'll guide you." After applying the medicine, Fang Xingjian immediately felt that his injuries were much better. The effects of the Netherworld Valley's medicinal ointment were much better than he had imagined. The organs in his body, which had initially deteriorated, were now emitting vigorous life force. Even many of the fine blood vessels and nerves which he had been unable to bind together had started to heal. Fang Xingjian let out a deep breath, which was filled with the stench of fresh blood. That was the dissolved, extravasated blood. Looking at how much more relaxed Fang Xingjian had become, a perplexed expression flashed past Jack's face. Just then, a sharp whistle rang out. Jack's face suddenly trembled as he shouted, "He's here! Mamukia is here!" At the same time, Kaunitz suddenly smiled. He looked at the fireless nature scroll in his hand and smiled, saying, "It's done. Let's go. It's time for us to make our appearance." Cynthia said in an eerie tone, "After following them for so long, they're finally done?" At the next moment, he, Rebecca, Cynthia, and Cynthia's husband suddenly sped up, rushing towards Fang Xingjian, who was 2 kilometers away. Chapter 143. Too slow, too slow, too slow. Ever since I was 5 years old, every time I opened my eyes, the first thing I heard was teacher's lion-like furious roar. I was from Garcia. In Garcia, all the boys had to undergo warrior training from the age of 5. They said that I was born from a cheetah in the wilderness. Compared to the warriors who were born from bears, wolves, and dogs, my speed seemed to be faster. As for who my father was, no one knew. The people of Garcia did not need parents, only comrades. Running with weights, practicing with bows and arrows, training with spears, swords, and sabers. These were all common occurrences. We fought with lions and tigers in the forest, wrestled with huge bears on the ice plains, rode on big ships, crossed the straits, fought with pirates, and fought with soldiers. Too slow, too slow, too slow. Teacher's voice seemed to be ringing in my ears forever, urging us to train harder, to increase our speed, to be faster, stronger, and more ruthless. Failure meant death. More and more warriors died during these trainings, but every year there would be more warriors participating in the training. We were the people of Garcia. We were natural warriors, a race protected by the gods. We thirsted for fresh blood, thirsted for battle. War was our instinct, and plundering was the source of our happiness. Too slow, too slow, too slow. Teacher's voice was too noisy, echoing in my ears every day, making me feel as if my head was hurting. I even suspected that a bug had entered my ears through the seawater when I was crossing the straits. I cut open my skull myself and checked carefully, only to discover that there were no bugs at all. It was just that teacher's voice was too noisy. Too slow, too slow, too slow. Your speed is too slow. When I was 30 years old, it was also that year that I finally could not hear teacher's voice anymore. It was because I had personally cut off his head and tied it to my belt. I let him experience my speed personally. He never said that I was too slow again. In this great peace, I finally felt countless calls that I could not normally feel. They were calls from the ether particles. Looking back, those who were of the same age as me had all turned into skeletons. I chased the wind, I sprinted towards the lightning. I hunted the strongest, ferocious beasts on the grassland. I caught the most terrifying sea monsters in the sea. My speed became faster and faster. The world became slower and slower in my eyes. 5 years later, when I returned to the tribe, they called me Mumkoya. Whoosh! In the air, there seemed to be something sharp sweeping past. It seemed like a breeze, like lightning, but it also seemed like an illusion. A kind of numbing feeling came from his body. The bearded knight was stunned. Seeing that everyone was looking at him, he asked in surprise, "What's wrong with you guys? Why are you all looking at me?" In the next moment, his entire body was instantly torn into pieces. His exploding blood and internal organs splattered all over the bald man beside him. Only then did the terrifying whistling sound reach everyone's ears, causing everyone's head to ache. The green-haired Rhea exclaimed, "It's Mamukia! Get into formation and use your reduced force field together." In the next moment, everyone gathered together and unleashed their reduced force field at full power. With so many knights' reduced force fields exploding at the same time, they encompassed every inch of space within a 10-meter radius. It was comparable to the power of a newly advanced conferred knight. However, just as everyone got into formation, the bald man who had been drenched in blood suddenly let out a loud bellow and dashed out with the saber in his hand. "Mamukia, come out. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you," Jack said anxiously. That's his biological younger brother. Rhea said furiously, "Get back here, idiot. Do you want to die?" However, that bald man did not pay any heed to Rhea's shouts and continued to dash out. The saber in his hand brought about strong gusts of wind, slashing through over 10 big trees. He shouted, "Come out, Mamukia. Fight with me. Didn't you want to kill us? Come out and fight with me." In the next moment, a silhouette flashed past once again. This time around, everyone could see clearly that it was a blurry silhouette. The silhouette drew out a long black line and pierced through the bald man's body. Therefore, the bald man fell to the ground with both his legs broken. He continued to roll on the ground and let out agonizing cries. Wei Longzi, who was dressed in black robes, said in a low voice, "I'll go save him. Are you muddle-headed as well?" Rhea's brows furrowed. "He intentionally crippled him so that we can split up to save him. We must stay within the reduced force field of the 6 of us." Rhea gave it some thought and said, "Let's walk over slowly. The 6 of us will move together and get closer bit by bit." Therefore, the 6 of them maintained the activation of their reduced force fields, maintaining an even output of power as they slowly walked towards the point of the agonizing cries. However, they had just walked over 10 meters when sharp cry rang out once again. Jack let out a stifled grunt, and a stream of blood suddenly appeared on his arm. A strange voice spoke in broken common language. "Too slow. Too slow. Too slow. You guys are too slow." Rhea said viciously, "He's testing out the weak points of our force fields. We can't move." After all, the 6 of them did not have good teamwork. The moment they moved, the weak points of their overlapping force fields would be attacked. However, it was true that the power of a second transition expert was not something that a first transition expert could deal with easily. Even though the 6 of them were standing still, Mamukia waited for a while before launching another series of assassinations. Streams of afterimages swept past the edges of the force fields, occasionally letting out sounds of metal clashing and bringing about a series of sparks. Those were the daggers in Mamukia's hands, stabbing into their knight attire, armor, or swords. Although each attack was weakened by everyone's reduced force fields, the terrifying power and speed still continued to deplete everyone's physical strength, leaving wounds on each of their bodies. If not for the fact that the 6 of them had combined their reduced force fields to envelop them, causing Mamukia's strength and speed to be greatly reduced each time he entered a 10-meter radius, allowing him to leave with a single attack, they would have died long ago. However, even so, wounds continued to appear on their bodies, and their physical strength was continuously depleted. The situation would only get more and more dangerous. Mamukia's voice rang out from afar like a night owl. "Too slow, too slow, too slow. Not a single one of you can think of escaping." Rhea bellowed, "Move. Staying here is equivalent to waiting for death." The 6 of them moved like tortoises as they performed their force fields. However, Mamukia was like a laborious bee, continuously piercing and attacking them. Wounds were left on their bodies one after another. Blood continued to flow out, forming spots of blood on the ground. Although Jack was nervous, he kept his eyes fixed on Feng Xingjian, as if wanting to know his situation. Chapter 144. Light gathered in Feng Xingjian's eyes. The medicinal ointment from the Netherworld Valley was extremely effective. Within a short period of time, he could feel that the injuries in his body had mostly healed, and it no longer affected his battle prowess. However, he still did not make his move. He stared at the silhouette that was darting to and fro, trying to assassinate them. This speed is no longer inferior to mine. No, this Mamukia is even faster than me when I perform boundaries negation. He will only be at his weakest when he's within 10 meters of us and gets weakened by our reduced force fields when he attacks. Flaws. We must wait for his flaws. Find a chance to suppress him. In Fang Xingjian's consciousness, the unknown mental cultivation method was burning like a raging flame. His blood seemed to be heating up, but his mind was calm. His high agility motion vision and unparalleled sword intent circulated crazily, searching for Mamukia's extremely minute flaws. However, the other party's speed was too fast, and his attacks were too vicious and experienced. Fang Xingjian continued to suppress his impulses, waiting for the other party's flaws. It was because he knew that once he made his move, he would only have 50 seconds. If he could not get rid of the other party within 50 seconds, they would be doomed. Is this how it is? Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh sounds rang out incessantly, as if blood was spurting out, as if blades were slashing through the air. Tai Long's armor let out a soft sound, and fresh blood spurted out from the gaps in his armor. Fang Xingjian tilted his head back slightly, but a line of blood still appeared on his cheek, causing a large portion of his face to be dyed red with blood. Each time Mamukia entered the reduced force fields of the six of them, he would feel as if the gravity had suddenly increased by 10 times. There were chaotic forces everywhere trying to block his attacks. Despite this, with his strong physical attributes and battle instinct that were like that of a wild beast, he continued to increase his speed and charge out. Then, relying on the high-speed movement due to inertia, he pierced through the chaotic force fields time and time again, leaving fresh wounds on everyone's bodies. Ha ha! Amidst his maniacal laughter, Mamukia grabbed the Baldy's head and lifted him up. The huge loss of blood from his legs had caused the Baldy to lose consciousness. Mamukia used his dagger to cut off the Baldy's head, then made a throat-slitting gesture towards Rhea and the others. All of you will die. Rhea and the rest glared furiously at Mamukia, but there was nothing they could do. Garcia's second transition destined warrior might not be comparable to the Empire's second transition destined warriors, but to first transition knights like them, they still had an incomparable advantage. Even though Mamukia's strength attribute was insufficient for him to go up against the six people's reduced force fields, he could still rely on his unparalleled speed to slowly exhaust the six of them to death. You can't escape. One by one, all of you must die, because you are too slow, too slow, too slow. Rhea said angrily, "Hold on. Reinforcements are definitely on the way." Looking at Fang Xingjian, who was in a daze, Wei Longzi patted him on the shoulder and said, "Lad, don't be afraid." Gran grinned. "At worst, I'll die. At least before I die, I'll leave something on this black devil." Faced with Mamukia's omnipresent and incessant attacks, Rhea and the others were gradually reaching their limits. Their physical strength was continuously being depleted, and they were almost unable to unleash their full powers. However, at the next moment, Fang Xingjian's pupils were like pitch-black black holes. His unparalleled sword intent was activated to its limits, causing green veins to pop up on his forehead. A loud clang rang out. Violent sound waves shook the surroundings, and the black-skinned, black-eyed wild beast revealed its tracks for the first time. The dagger in its hand was clearly not an ordinary item either, as it clashed fiercely against Fang Xingjian's silver dragon. The four people at the side bellowed in their hearts. He blocked it. How is this possible? This lad, how did he do it? In that instant, it was as if time had stopped in the entire world. Everyone watched as Fang Xingjian and Mamukia clashed against each other in midair. In less than a second, astonishment, surprise, and all sorts of emotions flashed past their eyes, not allowing them to react in time. This time around, Fang Xingjian had left Mamukia in the reduced force field. With this momentary pause, only two people present managed to react. Rhea and Wei Longzi unleashed their reduced force fields crazily, and an invisible force collided against Mamukia's body, causing a stifled sound to ring out. However, this was already their limit. With their reactions and speed, they were unable to perform a second attack. Mamukia's expression was savage, and he stomped on the ground, wanting to dash out of the reduced force field's encirclement with his remaining speed. However, just as he was retreating crazily, a dazzling light lit up. Fang Xingjian had brazenly activated the radiant light sword technique, which he had learned from Zhou Yong. The piercing light was like a flash grenade, lighting up Mamukia's vision. It was a pity that the level of Fang Xingjian's radiant light sword technique was not high. The dazzling light only caused Mamukia to be dazzled for half a second at most. However, to high-speed competitors like them, half a second was extremely crucial. The next moment, another beam of silver light pierced towards Mamukia. Fang Xingjian held the silver dragon in his right hand and the metal sword in his left. He did not have time to perform the supreme Mistwind sword and had already activated Boundary's negation to give chase. Silver light flashed. The first sword, Mamukia, could not see clearly and could only rely on his beast-like instincts to fend off the attack. The first sword was blocked by the dagger he swung with his remaining strength. The second sword, Mamukia twisted his body like a huge python, dodging it once again. The third sword, the silver dragon, slashed downwards, slashing towards Mamukia's thigh artery. At this moment, Mamukia was continuously attacked and slowed down. He was actually within the range of the reduced force field. As he had used up all his strength and had yet to generate new strength, coupled with the fact that his vision was blurry, he made a mistake and did not manage to use his dagger to protect his lower body. Mamukia was slowed down and stopped. Then, he was hit by the dazzling light. Fang Xingjian's series of attacks finally caused Mamukia to reveal a small opening. It was such a small opening that Fang Xingjian grasped it tightly. With a savage look on his face, Mamukia put out his other hand and blocked the silver dragon. Amidst the slashes, countless sparks lit up. The silver dragon had slashed onto Mamukia's reduced force field. However, Mamukia was not known for his strength to begin with. His strength attribute was only 95 plus, and when he covered his body with a reduced force field for defense, its prowess was greatly reduced. On the other hand, Fang Xingjian's silver dragon was a level 7 Empire's divine weapon. Chi 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 chi. Amidst the exploding sparks, Mamukia's reduced force field was finally slashed apart like layers of a cake. The next moment, Mamukia's palm was slashed apart by the Empire's divine weapon, leaving a bloody hole in the center of his palm. He finally let out an enraged bellow, making use of this momentary delay to dash out. At this moment, crackling sounds rang out. It was the second wave of attacks from the others who were chasing after Mamukia. They continued to attack him with their reduced force fields, but they were unable to catch up to his speed. However, there was still one person who gave chase. The silver sword light was like a maggot attached to a bone, once again chasing up to Mamukia's head. However, Mamukia was no longer restricted by the reduced force field. He raised his dagger and blocked the silver dragon. Chapter 145. Dang 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 dang. The concentrated sounds of collisions rang out intensely like a violent storm. As Fang Xingjian and Mamukia dashed forward, the daggers in their hands clashed crazily. Silver sword light and yellow sparks were like many meteors, chasing after their bodies as they flashed continuously in the forest. Fang Xingjian did not give his opponent any chance to treat his injuries. He activated Boundary's negation at full power, and the long sword in his left hand swung out the supreme Mistwind sword. Streams of sword cheese shot out in all directions like an atmospheric dragon, leaving behind a large area of ruins. This helped him increase his speed. At the same time, the silver dragon flashed crazily, piercing towards Mamukia. Too slow, too slow, too slow. Mamukia, you're too slow. Mamukia's palm had been slashed open, but he did not dare to unleash his full power. that would open up his wound and cause him to bleed nonstop. It was also this opportunity that Fang Xingjian unleashed his full power, suppressing his opponent's speed. Roar! Hearing his opponent's sarcasm, Mamukia let out an enraged bellow. Ignoring his injuries, he stopped in his tracks, and his hand flashed crazily, sending out countless dagger shadows towards Fang Xingjian. The two of them stood where they were, and hundreds of cold gleams exploded between them. It was as if countless meteors had collided, exploding into countless starlight. Regardless of whether it was Mamukia or Fang Xingjian, there would be over 10 wounds exploding at almost every instant. In the blink of an eye, they were covered in blood. This was especially so for Fang Xingjian, where his bones were almost exposed, blood gushing out like a fountain. So fast, Fang Xingjian was astonished. After his opponent unleashed his full power, he was no longer a match for him. If not for the existence of his unparalleled sword intent, constantly attacking his opponent's flaws and forcing him to defend himself, his throat would have been slit and his heart pierced by Mamukia within a few seconds. Furthermore, Mamukia's strength had completely suppressed him, causing him to retreat immediately after each clash. He did not dare to go head-on against Mamukia, and could only use his extraordinary sword arts realm to parry and deflect the force, continuously attacking his opponent's flaws in order to save himself. To others, it seemed as if he was suppressing Mamukia. However, only he himself knew how much pressure he was under right now. I can't be wrong. I can't be wrong. Each of Fang Xingjian's moves had to force Mamukia to come to his rescue. Only then would he be able to fight against his opponent when his speed was slower and his strength was completely suppressed. And the moment he made a mistake in his moves, Mamukia's unparalleled speed would be able to slice his head open. The pressure of life and death continued to assault Fang Xingjian's body as he circulated his boundaries negation to the maximum. The mental cultivation method in his mind was rumbling, as though it would explode at the very next moment. Large beads of sweat continuously appeared on Fang Xingjian's forehead, but they were quickly flung away. Under extreme tension and pressure, Fang Xingjian focused all of his attention on the battle before him. Every muscle fiber, every bone, and every blood vessel seemed to be exerted to the extreme. Rhea, who was at the side, drew her bow and arrows, shooting out streams of green light. The others also performed their reduced force fields to attack from a distance of 10 meters. However, they could only touch each other's afterimages. This won't do. My bow and arrows won't be able to catch up to him. Rhea looked at this scene in disbelief. To think that this rookie can keep up with Mamukia's movements. He didn't just keep up. Wei Longzi's expression was as if he had seen something unbelievable. He seems, Tai Long, who was completely covered in armor, mumbled, "He seems to be suppressing Mamukia." Gran drew in a cold breath. Mamukia is not his match. Suddenly, Wei Longzi's gaze flickered as he said, "Wait a minute." He said that he's from Cursed Royal Academy. This year, Cursed Royal Academy has produced a genius who transitioned into a windstorm sword hero. Could it be? But even if it's really him, Mamukia is at second transition level 20. What a joke. Although Garcia's destined warriors were far from the Empire's conferred knights, ordinary first transition knights had never been able to go up against them head-on. Mamukia's face started to turn green, and blood gushed out from his other hand. The wound was getting more and more painful, and more blood was flowing out. However, under the extreme pressure, Fang Xingjian continued to improve. Each of his moves and stances were extremely ingenious. Not only did he fend off Mamukia's attacks, he even started to gain the upper hand. It was as if he had been squeezed down to a tiny point by endless pressure, and then in the end, he suddenly exploded. He felt calm, as if there was nothing more important between life and death. It was as if nothing was more important than fighting Mamukia and killing him in the end. As the pressure lessened, the mental cultivation method in his brain circulated increasingly fiercely. The last few words on the stats window also became increasingly clear. However, at the next moment, Mamukia unleashed an explosive force, allowing the silver dragon to slash a wound on his chest, forcefully slashing a distance of several tens of meters away from Feng Xingjian. With a dash, he retreated. After all, his strength was still stronger than Feng Xingjian's. His eyes narrowed slightly, and the muscles under his skin kept on trembling. It was as if there was a huge snake slithering about, accompanied by waves of black aura coming out from the surface of his body, wanting to charge out at any moment. He could tell that the other party's moves were exquisite, and he seemed to have entered a state of enlightenment, no longer intending to compete with the other party in terms of moves. Very good. All of you are very good. It's been a very long time since I've been injured. He looked at Feng Xingjian with a gaze like that of a venomous snake. I'll take good care of you and eat you up piece by piece. However, at the next moment, he suddenly felt an extremely powerful and evil aura closing in on him. This was his specialty, wild beast intuition, which he had obtained after going through countless life and death situations. It allowed him to sense great threats in advance, and it had also helped him escape from countless situations where he would definitely die. Their reinforcements? Frowning, Mamukia did not hesitate in the slightest. It could be said that he had escaped at lightning speed without any hesitation. If he did not manage to hit his target in one strike, he would escape far away. Once he sensed any danger, he would escape with his unparalleled speed. This was the reason why he had been able to survive till now. People from the Empire, just you wait. The next time we meet, I'll kill all of you one by one. Without the reduced force field to delay him, Mamukia escaped with all his might, and it was impossible for the others to catch up to him. Looking at the injured Mamukia escaping, Feng Xingjian let out a cold laugh. He wiped off the fresh blood at the corner of his lips, and a feeling of exhilaration coursed through his entire body. Traveling alone, he had chased Mamukia for 1,000 miles. Now, although he had not managed to kill Mamukia, he had finally forced him to retreat. Loud rumbling sounds rang out in Feng Xingjian's mind. His mental cultivation method circulated faster and faster, as if it could achieve a breakthrough at any moment and completely complete the mutation of this mental cultivation method. He could sense that a powerful force was brewing in this mental cultivation method. Once it was completed, the mental cultivation method, which had undergone a mutation, would possess a terrifying prowess. The incident in Cursed City had allowed him to complete an epiphany in his spirit. Mamukia's 1,000-mile pursuit, as well as the battles he had gone through along the way, had allowed him to complete the tempering of his spirit. The more epiphanies he had, the harder the tempering would be. Naturally, the more benefits he would gain, and the stronger the mutated mental cultivation method would be. And Feng Xingjian wanted to use his own strength to clear the world, to break through all darkness and filth. What kind of epiphany and wish was this? And now, he was alone, with a sword in his hand, chasing after Mamukia for 1,000 miles, exchanging blows with a second transition warrior. How difficult would it be to kill a second transition warrior at the first transition stage? How strong would such a mutated mental cultivation method be? Feng Xingjian was getting more and more excited. Although the tens of saber wounds on his body were serious, to the point where his flesh was badly mutilated and his bones could be seen, his unparalleled sword intent had managed to avoid the fatal injuries. Feng Xingjian circulated his energy slightly, activating his specialties internal healing, internal training, and elementary berserkness at the same time. He had already compressed his wounds and stopped the bleeding. With his current physical attributes, although ordinary physical wounds would hurt and cause him to lose a large amount of vital energy and blood, they would not cause him to lose his battle prowess. With a glance, the circulation of his mental cultivation method was getting more and more intense. Feng Xingjian took a step forward, wanting to chase after Mamukia. His boundaries negation could still be used for 32 seconds. To be on the safe side, he would have at least 10 seconds to try to attack Mamukia again. If he failed, he would retreat. He felt that as long as he could grab hold of the opportunity, his mental cultivation method could undergo a transformation at any moment. However, just as he took this step forward, his face flushed and a large mouthful of blood spurted out from his mouth. Chapter 146. An intense pain spread through his entire body, as if countless amounts of sulfuric acid were corroding his body. Fang Xingjian reached out his trembling hand towards the antidote in his robes. "Have I been poisoned? When did it happen?" He directly opened the cap of the antidote bottle and gulped down the entire bottle of antidote. Rhea and the others dashed over as well. "Lad, you've really kept us in the dark. To think that you managed to push Mamukia back. How high is your agility attribute?" "Cursed Academy's guy, you're Fang Xingjian, right? The genius who transitioned into a windstorm sword hero." However, after saying a few words, the few of them immediately realized that something was wrong with Fang Xingjian. Ugh! Another mouthful of blood spewed out from his mouth. Fang Xingjian felt that the world before him had turned dark, and he was already half kneeling on the ground. The blood he had spat out was like viscous venom, immediately causing a large area of the ground to corrode. "What's wrong with you?" Rhea gasped. Wei Longzi had already supported Fang Xingjian and said coldly, "He's been poisoned. Is Mamukia's dagger poisoned? Have we been poisoned as well?" Grand asked anxiously. Just at this moment, a long laugh once again attracted everyone's attention. "Haha, don't worry. You guys aren't poisoned." Dressed in a red robe, the flame patterns on his head pulsating as if they were burning, Countess walked into the battlefield. Rebecca, Cynthia, and Cynthia's husband, Zakov, followed behind him. Zakov looked in the direction that Mamukia had escaped in and said worriedly, "Mamukia seems to be injured. Should we chase after him first?" "There's no need for that. He's just a barbarian from Garcia. There's no need to pay any attention to him." Countess looked coldly at Fang Xingjian, his eyes filled with pride and ecstasy. "Fang Xingjian is our target." He led the three of them to a spot 15 meters away from Rhea and the rest. Looking at Rhea and the rest who were blocking his way, Countess smiled. "Why? You guys want to stop me?" Rhea frowned and asked, "Who are you? Do you have anything to do with the poisoning of Fang Xingjian?" Countess ignored Rhea and turned his head to look at Fang Xingjian, who was protected by the crowd. Looking at the other party's pale face and trembling cheeks, Countess smiled even more delightedly. Countess enjoyed the feeling of this moment and looked at Fang Xingjian with excitement. "Fang Xingjian, the poison in your body is not an ordinary poison. It has been mixed with healing medicine and will slowly hide in your body as you heal your injuries. It has a very long incubation period and will only take effect after it has completely fused into your bloodstream and traveled through your entire body. Once it flared up, all the muscles, bones, and organs in one's body would be corroded, and one wouldn't be able to use even a fraction of their strength. At this point, even the antidote from the Netherworld Valley would be useless. And the intense movements you made in the battle earlier have caused the poison to spread throughout your entire body. Do you understand? Right now, not only are your limbs weak, but because of your weakened body, you can't even focus your consciousness. You can't even maintain your waves and mental cultivation method. Naturally, you won't be able to use your reduced force field either. You won't be able to use any extraordinary strength or techniques. Haha, although you won't die, you won't be able to use even a fraction of your strength. The current you, even a child, would be able to easily kill you." Looking at Countess's proud expression, Rhea's eyes were filled with disbelief. She questioned, "Are you crazy? Helping the Garcia people to poison their own people? What on earth are you trying to do?" What's so special about a mere Garcia person? Only commoners like you wouldn't be able to see the situation clearly. Compared to a few Garcia aboriginals, a genius like Fang Xingjian is much more important." Rhea stood in front of Fang Xingjian and said coldly, "Since that's the case, all the more we can't let you act recklessly. Fang Xingjian is the Empire's genius and the country's treasure. We'll report the matter of you poisoning him to the association. You can just wait to be investigated." He. Investigated? Ha ha ha. Countess covered his face and started laughing. The more he laughed, the louder his voice became. In the blink of an eye, His maniacal laughter had already spread through the forest several hundred meters away. Are you an idiot? With a tap of his finger, a crimson-red flame pierced through the air like a laser beam. That was the divine flames of the Earth's core. Its prowess was comparable to a high-powered laser weapon. No, Rhea. No one could react in time. Rhea lowered her head in a daze and looked at her chest. The crimson-red light had already pierced through her chest. Rhea. In that instant, Wei Longzi had already dashed into her embrace. Seeing Rhea spitting out blood incessantly, he trembled incessantly, not knowing what to do. He and Rhea had grown up together, picked up martial arts together, went through examinations together, participated in the prefectural selection together, and then became knights together. She had long since become his lover and kin. Looking at Rhea, who had fallen into his embrace, he felt as if the whole world had collapsed. Tai Long, who was completely wrapped up in armor, walked over and said furiously, "Her lungs have been pierced through, and the blood has blocked her windpipe. She can't breathe anymore. We need to think of a way to treat her. I know how to perform first aid. Let me try first." Grand walked over. Tai Long and Wei Longzi turned and looked at Kaunitz with killing intent. Wei Longzi held on to both swords and crossed them before his chest. The coldness in his words seemed to be able to freeze the air. "No matter who you are, you're dead meat." How childish. Do you think that we'll let you guys leave? Kaunitz shook his head. You die and I die. Wasn't it clear when I explained it earlier? You only understand now. It's just like what His Highness said. The Empire's knights have already been corrupted. Those who believe in justice, morality, love, and light will never be truly powerful. The weak are prey to the strong, and the victor is king. This is the truth of this world. Shut up, scum. Go and reflect on yourself in hell. Wei Longzi slashed out with both swords, and countless electric currents jumped about between the blades of the two swords. It was as if an electrical net had encompassed Kaunitz. However, Kaunitz only smiled and shook his head. The next moment, 3 silhouettes dashed out from behind him. Rebecca, Cynthia, and Zakov were all elders who had been nurtured by their clans for decades. They were old monsters who had been in the first transition for decades. Their 5 major attributes had been nurtured by countless heavenly and earthly treasures and ferocious beasts, allowing them to reach 100 points. In addition to the many specialties they had honed themselves, they were almost invincible amongst those in the first transition. Thud, thud, thud sounds rang out. Tai Long, Grand, and Wei Longzi had already been knocked down to the ground. Fresh blood flowed out slowly from their bodies, and intense pain came from all over their bodies. Looking at the 3 of them whose faces were contorted in pain, Kaunitz smiled and walked up to Fang Xingjian. Seeing that his eyes were tightly shut, as if he was still recuperating, Kaunitz smiled and said, "Fang Xingjian, are you still trying to recuperate? It's useless. This poison is called eternal wounds. If you don't use the antidote, it's impossible for you to recover. How is it? Are you feeling that it's getting harder and harder to breathe? That's because your internal organs are starting to weaken." He thought to himself, the strength of my heart has weakened, and even my stomach is about to stop moving. The speed of my blood flow has also slowed down. Kaunitz's ears twitched, displaying the powerful 5 senses of the hell indestructible physique. Seeing that Fang Xingjian was still expressionless, closing his eyes to recuperate, Kaunitz's lips twitched, and he said, "Right, at this stage, you should know who poisoned you, right?" Chapter 147. Fang Xingjian closed his eyes and continued to circulate the vital energy, blood, muscles, and bones in his body. As he treated his injuries, he also wanted to force them out one by one. However, the poison had already entered all the organs in his body through his bloodstream. How was he to force it out at this moment? He continued to circulate his energy to move his organs, agitate his vital energy and blood. Internal healing, internal training, and the elementary berserkness physique were all unleashed. Only then was he able to fend off the worsening of the poison. Use internal healing and internal training to slow down the flow of vital energy and blood, reduce the invasion of the poison, and then rely on the elementary berserkness physique to withstand it. It should be possible. Despite this, Fang Xingjian's current body was just as Countess had said. His limbs were weak, and his organs were weak. Even breathing had started to become difficult for him, let alone battling. He could not even maintain waves. After Countess said his final words, Jack walked over with a gloomy expression. His eyes were lifeless, and he looked like a walking corpse. However, seeing this, Countess became even more excited. At the same time, he continued to speak to the first prince in his body. Your Highness, Fang Xingjian is an unruly and extremely arrogant person. If we don't suppress him, he won't be able to accept it. Now that both his body and mind are weak, it's the best time for us to suppress him. Although the first prince knew that Countess was taking revenge, he also knew that what he said made sense. It was true that Fang Xingjian was too arrogant and had to be suppressed. Therefore, the first prince just watched as Countess carried out his moves. Jack walked up to Countess and half knelt down, saying, Young Master Countess, I've done what I needed to do. What you promised me. Don't worry. Your daughter and wife are fine. Countess smiled and patted Jack's head as if he was patting a dog. He looked at Fang Xingjian and said, Fang Xingjian, do you see this? This is your friend. This is the person whom you have guided in your martial skills. But as long as I say the word, he will die for me right now. He can even poison you directly. Looking at Fang Xingjian's frown, Countess laughed and said, Fang Xingjian, do you understand now? Was talent important? Of course it was important, but a person's limit was determined by his parents, his family, and his background from the moment he was born. Commoners were destined to be commoners. If they wanted to make a name for themselves, they had to work for the nobles. Our resources, our savings, our knowledge, and our inheritance are beyond your imagination. As he spoke, he walked in front of Fang Xingjian and stepped on his chest. Although Fang Xingjian was furious, he did not have the strength to resist. Just like now, I can casually squash you like an ant, but what about you? How are you going to resist? Countess shook his head. You don't have the power to resist, Fang Xingjian. You've lost our duel. I know you're still not convinced, but this only shows how childish you are. The winner takes all, and the loser takes all. Who cares how the winner wins? Power, wealth, background. These are all part of one's strength. This world isn't a place where you can do whatever you want with your talent alone. Just then, Countess suddenly looked at Jack with great interest and said, The city guard have taught you how to use torture, right? Jack frowned, but when he thought of his wife and daughter, he still replied dejectedly, Yes. Countess laughed. Then do it to Fang Xingjian. I really want to see how you're going to torture him. Jack said resolutely, Sir, this is different from what we agreed on. Countess shook his finger and said, You don't have the right to negotiate with me. Do it quickly, or I'll sell your daughter to a brothel. Oh, that might not be the case. I've heard that there are many nobles who like little girls and mother and daughter. I can ask if there are any among them I know. How long do you think your daughter can last? She's quite cute, so how long will it take for her to be broken? How long will it take for her to turn into a lump of rotten meat in the sewers? Hearing Countess's narration and threats, a crazed struggle flashed in Jack's eyes. He clenched and unclenched his fists. When Countess reached the end of his narration, a hint of hatred flashed in his eyes as he shouted loudly, Enough! With that, he took out a small knife and walked toward Fang Xingjian with unsteady steps, as if he had lost all signs of life. Ha! Jack laughed and turned to look at Fang Xingjian. Do you see this? This is the charm of power. Fang Xingjian, do you understand the difference between us now? He patted Jack on the shoulder and continued. Fang Xingjian, let me ask you a question. If you sign the devil's note now and become the first prince's subordinate, then everything from before will be written off. Otherwise, I'll really get Jack to make a move. What could be more interesting than watching Fang Xingjian's underling stab at Fang Xingjian again and again? Countess looked at Fang Xingjian in anticipation, waiting for his reply. Fang Xingjian did not pay him any heed. He continued to close his eyes, using all his might to fight against the poison in his body. It was as if even opening his eyes would waste his energy. Countess patted Jack on the shoulder and said, "Go on. Let me see what the city guards are capable of." Jack did not say anything. He was like a zombie as he held the small knife and walked forward. As he spoke, he had already walked up to Fong Xingjian's back. With a sound, the small knife in his hand pierced into Fong Xingjian's back chest. Fong Xingjian let out a stifled groan and could not help but tremble a little. Jack's tone was filled with despair as he said gloomily, "There's a gap in the human body. There are no organs or major blood vessels. It's very painful, but it won't cause serious injuries." Countess nodded in satisfaction. Jack looked at Fong Xingjian, and his hand, which was holding onto the knife, trembled. At the same time, he said in a soft voice, "Xingjian, don't blame me. My daughter and wife are with them. I really have no other way." After a few stabs, no matter how Jack forced or persuaded, Fong Xingjian did not show any reaction. Fong Xingjian even made use of these few stabs to force out the poisonous blood in his body, letting out streams of foul-smelling poisonous blood onto the ground. This made his body feel relaxed. However, seeing how Fong Xingjian would rather die than submit, Jack did not know why, but the sense of shame in his heart grew even stronger. His heart was filled with extreme frustration. At this moment, shame and anger triumphed over shame. Jack only felt that the Fong Xingjian before him was extremely detestable, making him appear extremely repulsive. Looking at how cold Fong Xingjian was, he finally exploded. "What do you know? You're all alone. You have no wife, no children. You have no idea how I feel." With another stab, Jack shouted, "Fong Xingjian, what on earth are you holding on for? Can't you agree quickly? What's wrong with surrendering to the first prince? What on earth are you holding on to?" Countess, who was watching from the side, smiled. His eyes were filled with excitement and satisfaction. However, how could Fong Xingjian possibly care about Jack? He continued to heal his injuries. After finding out about the poison in his body, he continued to use his internal healing specialty to slow down the flow of his vital energy and blood, alleviating the symptoms of the poison. Thereafter, when the other party stabbed him, he released the poisonous blood and slowed down the spread of the remaining poisonous blood. He then started to recover with his berserk physique. He felt as if his body had once again become more relaxed. On the other side, Mamukia had not really left. Instead, he was watching everything from several hundred meters away from Fong Xingjian and the others. He stroked his chin and said, "Internal strife?" His eyes stared at Countess as he mumbled to himself, "This red guy, what's on him? Why does he give me such a strong sense of threat?" Just then, his ears twitched and he turned his head. He saw a young lady dressed in black battle clothes descending from the sky and landing lightly behind him. It was Fong Qian, the #1 genius from the Fong clan's branch family in Demonic City. Seeing Fong Qian's appearance, Mamukia immediately knelt down and said, "Lord Oracle, why have you come?" However, Fong Qian's face was filled with displeasure. "Mamukia, what's wrong with you? Why are you afraid of battle?" Mamukia lowered his head and said, "I'm not afraid of battle. It's just that I can sense an unknown and powerful power from that red-robed man. Don't find excuses for your cowardice." Fong Qian let out a cold snort and said, "Follow me out. If we capture Fong Xingjian, it'll be a great merit and we'll be rewarded by the gods." However, just as the two of them were arguing endlessly, a long whistle rang out from afar. In the sky several thousand meters away, a black line came attacking at a rapid speed. It was as if it had slashed the entire sky apart, splitting the cloud layers in the sky into two. A silhouette dashed over at high speed. With each step he took, a stream of purple sword force would appear under his feet, allowing him to charge forward continuously in the sky, as if he was walking on flat ground. Countess's brows twitched as he said anxiously, It's that old B***starred Huang Lin." The first prince laughed out loud. That old B***starred must have heard the news about Mamukia and came here to provide assistance. He's the only one here today. It's really good that he's here." As he spoke, he darted out from Countess's body and expanded with the wind. In the blink of an eye, he had turned into a huge flaming man over 10 meters tall, charging toward Huang Lin, who was dashing over from the horizon. Chapter 148. George. Huang Lin stood on two streams of purple sword force, looking at the man on fire who had soared into the sky. His gaze turned even colder. He lowered his head and looked in Countess's direction. When he saw Feng Xingjian, his eyes narrowed slightly, like a tiger that had seen its prey. "George, you shouldn't have laid your hands on my disciple." Huang Lin's voice was very cold, like the Siberian night breeze, causing one to feel a bone-piercing chill. The first prince laughed out loud, and the heat waves formed by the high-temperature flames shook the air, giving off a feeling as if the world was trembling. "Huang Lin, you're an old dog that my younger brother has reared. You're not bad at teaching disciples. 10 years ago, one died. To think that there's an even better seedling now. However, I, George Krieg, have dominated the world for decades. All the outstanding talents in the world should naturally be under me. Back then, I let your disciple go. Today, you can return the favor with another disciple." Killing intent surged from Huang Lin. 10 years ago, he had still been in the imperial capital. His eldest disciple, Victor, was extremely talented in sword arts and cultivation. He had been like the sun, illuminating the entire imperial capital. However, he had not been able to resist the temptations brought by the aristocrats. Greedy for enjoyment, he had participated in banquets, gatherings, and salons, loitering in the rooms of many young ladies. When he was finally found, he was naked and dead in a woman's bed. When Huang Lin brought his corpse home, he could only find out that it was due to drug overdose, brain death, and other unbearable causes of death. Huang Lin could only vaguely find out that this matter had something to do with the first prince. He had then created a ruckus in the imperial capital and had been fired from his position. However, a talented conferred knight like him was a valuable asset. Even if he had been temporarily fired from his position, it was impossible for him to really disappear. He had then been assigned to the Western Garrison, and after many twists and turns, he had arrived at Curse Academy. And now, he had finally found a disciple in Cursed who was even more talented, more self-disciplined, and who might be able to go further in sword arts. "George." Huang Lin's voice was so cold that it made one's heart tremble. "You deserve to die." In the next moment, purple sword force surged out from Huang Lin's palm. 2 meters, 3 meters, 10 meters, and it was still growing. The first prince smiled. Huang Lin's killing technique, Void Slicing Longsword, was a killing technique that materialized one's strength. The greater the strength unleashed, the stronger the materialized sword force would be. When the purple sword force reached 50 meters, the first prince was still full of confidence. However, when the sword force rose to 100 meters, his expression turned grim. The biggest feature of the void-splitting longsword was that it could accumulate the physical strength of the void-splitting longsword time and time again. Now that the sword force had exceeded 100 meters, it was equivalent to Huang Lin's 100 attacks. "Huang Lin, looks like you haven't wasted your time in the past few years. Back then in the academy, you also hid your strength, right?" Huang Lin said, "George, if anything happens to my disciple today, after I kill this avatar of yours, I will go to the imperial capital and kill your real body." I'm arrogant. Seeing that the purple sword force was still growing, the first prince let out a cold snort, and his entire fire clone brought up a flame current that was several hundred zhang long. It was as if a rain of fire was raining down on Huang Lin. Purgatory demonic tome, great solar, unending flames. Streams of crimson gold flames turned into many fire rings, surrounding the first prince and Huang Lin. These crimson gold flames could burn through ether particles. Wherever they passed by, they would burn up all the ether particles inside and outside of the opponent's body, causing the opponent to be unable to unleash any extraordinary powers. Wherever the great solar unending flames passed by, almost all extraordinary powers would be eliminated. An unprecedentedly grim look flashed in Huang Lin's eyes. With a furious bellow, the over 100 meters long purple sword force in his hand burst forth, slashing out toward the flames. High temperature, kinetic energy, power. All sorts of things mixed together and then exploded. Amidst a loud boom, strong gales raged, mixed with the flames, blowing out in all directions like a fire tornado. The cloud layers within a range of several hundred meters were dispersed, and the strong gales came crashing down onto the ground, causing sand and rocks to fly and plants to topple. What was even more terrifying was that the great solar, unending flames gradually spread out, occupying the space bit by bit, making it impossible for Huang Lin to enter. And this was just the beginning. As the flames in the sky and the purple sword force continued to clash and explode, it was as if thunder kept on striking in the middle of the fire clouds. Layers of light and loud sounds burst forth, just like the great battles between gods and demons in legends. It's a pity that if my actual body was here, I'd be able to crush all of you with a single overturn hell. I wouldn't have to go through so much trouble. The first prince's actual body was a second transition level 29 expert, while Huang Lin was a second transition level 25 expert. Naturally, the two of them could not be mentioned in the same breath. After all, in the second transition realm, with each increase in level, one's abilities would undergo a tremendous change. This was why the first prince was able to suppress Huang Lin with just a clone that only had 10% of his powers. As if afraid of attacking the people below, the fire clouds continued to rise while exploding. In the blink of an eye, they were already several thousand meters away from the ground, and only faint flashes and explosions could be seen. Mamukia revealed an astonished expression. These Empire's conferred knights are really a disaster in human form. Compared to our destined warriors, they're really much stronger. If we were to fight them head-on, I wouldn't be a match for them. It's a pity. If we also had their legacies and grasped the method to break through the 10 heavenly barriers, changing the nature of the human body, Garcia's destined warriors wouldn't have to stop at level 20. The most unique characteristic of the Empire's second transition confer knights was that each level was a heavenly barrier. After clearing the heavenly barrier, they would be able to change the nature of a human body bit by bit, gaining a deeper understanding of ether particles. Regardless of whether it was their attributes, specialties, or techniques, the effects would all be strengthened and evolved to varying degrees. Fang Qian looked at the two people who continued to rise into the sky and let out a cold laugh, saying, "Stop looking. They're too far away, and it's a good thing for us. When they're a little further away, we'll make our move." With that, she looked toward Fang Xingjian and the others who were on the ground. Countess laughed out loud. "Fang Xingjian, how is it? When your teacher appeared earlier, did you think that you were saved? It's a pity that this time around, no one will be able to save you." As he spoke, his brows furrowed slightly, and his ears twitched as he said, Your heartbeat is recovering? Your internal organs are also starting to gain strength?" Countess did not know that Fang Xingjian had the specialties of internal healing and internal training, and that his martial arts had reached a level where he could control the circulation of vital energy and blood at a microscopic level. He also had the elementary berserkness physique, which allowed him to withstand remnant poison. Fang Xingjian also did not know that Countess had mastered the Inferno indestructible physique, and that his five senses were so sharp that he could clearly hear the movements of other people's internal organs and the circulation of vital energy and blood. Countess was stunned for a moment, and then at the next moment he struck out with his palm. This palm strike was made up of the full power of his physical palm, along with layers of reduced force field. 150% of his palm's power exploded, and air currents surged wildly, releasing crackling, explosive sounds. However, just as this palm strike was about to hit Fang Xingjian, the latter opened his eyes abruptly, and his body darted out when he was 1 inch away from the palm force. However, he had only darted out 10 meters when Fang Xingjian stumbled to a stop, and a foul stench of poisonous blood flowed out from the corner of his mouth. Countess looked at Fang Xingjian, who was struggling to hang on, and said coldly, "Fang Xingjian, even if your control over your body is astonishing and you manage to slow down the effects of the poison, you're only left with 30% of your full power. Are you still going to resist?" Rebecca, Cynthia, and Zakov all walked up, and a total of 4 experts at the pinnacle of the first transition surrounded Fang Xingjian. Wei Longzi, Tai Long, Grand, and the others, who were severely injured, all revealed expressions of despair. Looking at the scene before him, a hint of viciousness flashed in Jack's eyes as he walked up to Rebecca and the others. At this stage, he had no other way out. He had to completely side with the first prince, and suppressing Fang Xingjian was the only way out. "Fang Xingjian, don't blame me. If you want to blame someone, blame yourself for being too stubborn. The first prince is destined to be the future ruler of the empire. Why aren't you willing to side with him?" Thinking of this, he suddenly started to hate Fang Xingjian. If it wasn't for his stubbornness, if it wasn't for him doing things his own way, how could so many things have happened? His daughter and wife wouldn't have been kidnapped by Countess either. It's all your fault. Everything is your fault. In the sky, Huang Lin and the first prince were still locked in a stalemate. It was impossible for them to rush over within a short period of time. Fang Xingjian had already suffered from internal injuries to begin with, and now that he had been poisoned, his injuries had worsened. Even if he could temporarily use his unparalleled control over his body and physique to temporarily alleviate the poison, after being interrupted by Countess, he would only be left with 30% of his powers. Facing Countess, Fang Xingjian held onto the sword in his left hand and looked coldly at the 5 people before him, saying calmly, "To kill you bunch of weaklings, I would find it too much even if I used 10% of my powers, let alone 30%. Although the poison on his body had not been completely cleared, at least his consciousness had regained clarity. His waves started to circulate, and his mental cultivation method started to take effect. He can now use extraordinary powers and techniques. In the next moment, Boundaries Negation was activated, and with a step forward, the distance between Fang Xingjian and Countess was already 1 meter. Boundaries Negation could ignore the interference of other situations and directly unleash the user's agility attribute to its greatest limits. It was also at this moment that Fang Xingjian temporarily broke free from the interferences of being unable to unleash his attributes due to the poison and internal injuries. He burst forth with a speed 3 times that of supersonic speed. With a flash of silver light, the level 10 special effect of the Supreme Mistwind Sword was activated. The 3 feet sword light was indestructible, slashing down on Countess's chest from below. Countess let out a world-shaking, agonizing cry. A huge wound had been slashed open on his chest, and he retreated crazily. Rebecca, Cynthia, and Zakov, the 3 experts at the pinnacle of the first transition, attacked together, with Jack following closely behind. However, they had just arrived within 10 meters of Fang Xingjian when they saw flashes of sword light like bolts of lightning. Blood splattered out from the 4 of them as they screamed and ran away. At this moment, Fang Xingjian's Boundaries Negation only had 30 seconds left. Chapter 149. Jack stood there in a daze. He touched his neck, only to discover that his entire throat had been sliced open and fresh blood was flowing out everywhere. He reached out his hand, wanting to grab Fang Xingjian, wanting to say something. However, he could only see Fang Xingjian's back getting further and further away, no longer looking at him. With a bang, he fell onto the ground. As his blood flowed out, his body grew increasingly weaker. Even with the vitality of a first transition knight, he would not be able to hold on for much longer. The knight attire Rebecca was wearing was slashed into pieces. However, if it was not for the protection of the knight attire, she would have been slashed into minced meat. Despite this, her entire body was still covered in wounds. She looked at Fang Xingjian in astonishment. She could not understand how Fang Xingjian was able to do this, even though he was clearly severely injured and poisoned. Countess let out an agonizing cry. A wound the width of 2 fingers had appeared on his chest, and fresh blood flowed out like a fountain, forming a pool of blood under his feet. His human and dragon bloodline was activated, and the muscles on his chest continued to squirm, trying hard to heal bit by bit. At the same time, countless black scales rolled out from the surface of his body, turning him into a black-armored demon. Countenance looked at Feng Xingjian with a savage expression and said furiously, "Why? Why are you so stubborn? Why are you unwilling to accept the first prince?" Feng Xingjian said calmly, "People like you will never understand." The next moment, he took another step forward and got closer to Countenance. The supreme Mistwind sword turned into lightning, once again encompassing Countenance. Over 100 sword cheese struck Countenance's body, but they were unable to slash through the black scale armor on his body. This time around, Countenance focused 120% of his attention. Amidst the sword cheese that filled the sky, he could finally faintly sense that there seemed to be 3 invisible sharp blades slicing through the air. However, it was already too late. The speed of the 3-feet sword light, which was 3 times that of supersonic speed, was simply too fast. Countenance was unable to react at all. He felt an intense pain in his head, chest, and stomach. A sound like metal being cut rang out, and he was once again sent flying. Boundaries negation had 28 seconds left. Countenance cried out agonizingly as he fell to the ground. His infernal, indestructible physique scales were flipped over, and his bones burst out as fresh blood spurted out incessantly. Evil creature, stop right now. At the sight of this, Rebecca let out a furious bellow. Her silver hair danced wildly in the air as all 10 of her fingers tapped out in quick succession. Sword cheese of thunder and fire shot out in a frenzy, sweeping toward Feng Xingjian like a chain of machine guns. Such dense sword cheese could directly turn a truck into a sieve. However, Feng Xingjian merely swept out with a single sword, causing several hundred streams of sword cheese to sweep out in the air, directly destroying the thunder and fire sword cheese that Rebecca had shot out. What? Rebecca looked at this scene in disbelief. Most importantly, she did not see the opponent's sword move at all. It was simply too fast. Feng Xingjian continued to walk toward Countenance, who had fallen to the ground. Rebecca continued to send out streams of sword cheese of thunder and fire, but the moment they came within 10 meters of Feng Xingjian, they would be instantly destroyed. Feng Xingjian dashed out once again, slashing his sword at Countenance's neck. Sparks splattered and blood splattered out. Countenance was once again sent flying, but he was only injured and not dead. His opponent's infernal, indestructible physique's carapace was simply too tough. To think that Feng Xingjian's 3-foot sword light would only be able to penetrate 3 inches into Countenance's flesh. Boundaries negation still had 25 seconds left. At this moment, Cynthia also stood up, looking at her right arm, which was drenched in blood. Her face was filled with killing intent. "Good lad, if you want to go over, you'll have to ask me first." As she said this, she dashed out and stood in front of Countenance, slapping out with both palms. As ether particles surged wildly, a wave of heat currents was about to form. It was Cynthia's famous killing technique, formless fire. It was able to instantly heat up an area of several hundred meters with microwaves, causing one's blood to boil. However, before she could perform it or speak, Feng Xingjian let out a cold laugh, and with a flash, he appeared behind Cynthia. A hint of light flashed past Cynthia's neck. It was the light produced by the collision between the sword light and the reduced force field. The next moment, her head flew up into the sky. Even before it landed on the ground, it was still glaring at Feng Xingjian in disbelief. Feng Xingjian, who was in the state of boundaries negation, slashed out at the weak spot on her neck. It was not something that Cynthia's reduced force field would be able to fend off. However, with this slash, Feng Xingjian felt a wave of dizziness in his head. That was because the intense exercise had caused the poison in his body to circulate throughout his body once again, starting to act up. However, he did not stop. He did not even look at the corpse, which was standing still. Instead, he raised his head, wanting to slash at Countenance once again. With an extremely furious bellow, Cynthia's husband, Zakov, flew into a rage. His eyes were bloodshot, and he held onto a huge saber with a ghost's head in his hands. He leaped up high and slashed out toward Fang Xingjian's back. Fang Xingjian did not move. With a thought, his sword moved casually, sweeping out toward his back. However, with a crisp clang, it was blocked by Zakov. Oh! It was only then that Fang Xingjian turned back to take a look. During this process, he sent out another 3 consecutive sword thrusts, bringing along streams of cone-shaped air currents and thrusting toward where Zakov was. However, it was as if Zakov had foresight. Before Fang Xingjian had attacked, he had already placed his saber in front of him to block the attack. With 3 crisp clangs, he fell to the ground, but he had managed to block this sword attack. However, just as he landed on the ground, another stream of sword chi pierced toward his back. Just like before, he slashed backward with his saber, destroying this stream of sword chi. Fang Xingjian frowned and lifted his finger slightly. In an instant, another 3 streams of sword chi slashed toward Zakov's body from 3 different directions. However, it was still useless. No matter how Fang Xingjian attacked, Zakov would always be able to dodge and block before he attacked. This was a powerful killing technique which he had painstakingly cultivated for 30 years, intent before thought. It allowed him to predict the opponent's moves in advance and then block and counterattack. It could be said that his close combat prowess was far above that of his wife's. As long as there were flaws in his moves, it would be impossible for him to be defeated. However, in the next moment, Zakov was stunned for a moment. During this moment, Fang Xingjian's right hand turned into a layer of fog. Fang Xingjian's speed was too fast, and his afterimages were like a series of black shadows. Over 100 sword shadows circled around Zakov, leaving him no space at all. They slashed down at 3 times the speed of sound. There were no flaws, and Fang Xingjian crushed down purely with absolute power and speed. Zakov had no way of resisting at all. This was why he had been stunned when he had predicted this move. Boom! The air seemed to have been sliced into pieces in that instant. Over 100 sword slashes at 3 times the speed of sound caused countless sonic booms. It was as if countless explosives had exploded at the same time, and ripples that could be seen with the naked eye were sent out from the center. The people in the surroundings all revealed pained expressions, as if someone had taken a stick and stirred it in their heads. When the smoke dissipated, there was only a puddle of rotten flesh left on the spot. Zakov had died without a complete corpse. The 1,000 potential points per second continued to be depleted. Zakov and Cynthia had wasted their time, and there were only 15 seconds left before the limit of boundaries negation. After slashing out over 100 sword attacks in one go, Fang Xingjian also felt waves of weakness coming from his body. Waves of dizziness also came from his head, and his vision became blurry. Kaunitz, who was in the distance, had turned into a blurry black shadow. Fang Xingjian swayed a little and almost fell to the ground. What was worse was that as he continued to battle, he continued to circulate his waves and mental cultivation method. This caused his blood flow to increase once again, and the depletion of energy in his brain increased tremendously. Wave after wave of blood was sent to his brain. This was equivalent to poison being continuously sent to his brain. This won't do. I need to stop for a while. Feeling as if he would faint at any moment, Fang Xingjian stopped his boundaries negation and started to circulate his vital energy and blood, alleviating the poison through internal healing and internal training. There's still 15 seconds left after the poison is alleviated. It should be enough. However, throughout the entire process, his footsteps did not stop. Because the battle was still ongoing, he was like a patient who was staggering as he continued to walk towards Kaunitz. Rebecca, who was at the side, was still crazily releasing streams of sword chis of thunder and fire. However, it was as if she had met with an invisible barrier. Fang Xingjian was only using slashes at supersonic speed, and no matter how many streams of sword chis of thunder and fire she sent out, they would all be dissipated. "Stop, Fang Xingjian!" Rebecca shouted loudly. "Are you crazy? You want to go against the entire Treasure clan? To become the first prince's mortal enemy?" Kaunitz was still crying out in agony, clutching onto the wound on his chest. He looked furiously at Feng Xingjian, who was walking over slowly, and shouted, "Feng Xingjian, are you crazy? The poisonous blood in your body has not been completely cleansed. If you continue fighting like this, you'll die. Do you really want to die?" Feng Xingjian ignored him and continued to walk forward step by step. Although his steps were unsteady, they were extremely firm. Kaunitz had finally recovered, and the wound on his chest had already healed up. With a slight movement, the six-armed Azura's technique was activated, and four extremely thick and huge hands covered in black scales grew out from his shoulder blades and back. Boundless fury and jealousy turned into flames in his heart, causing Kaunitz's expression to become extremely distorted. "Feng Xingjian, why? Why are you so stubborn? The first prince is the supreme being in the world, the future hope of the entire world. Why are you unwilling to submit to him? Why are you so foolish?" As he spoke, his six arms turned into sword fingers, pointing out in Feng Xingjian's direction. Six streams of divine flames of the Earth's core were instantly shot out. These divine flames of the Earth's core were a type of high-temperature ray. The moment they were shot out, they traveled at the speed of light, and everywhere they passed by would be scorched by a high temperature of over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Thankfully, Feng Xingjian had already started to dodge the moment his opponent raised his hands. However, the divine flames of the Earth's core were at the speed of light, and they were simply too fast. Although he had dodged the moment his opponent raised his hands, he had only managed to avoid his vitals. His shoulders and calves were pierced through, and the smell of charred flesh continued to spread out. However, Feng Xingjian only let out a stifled grunt, activating his boundaries negation for the last 15 seconds. Leaving behind a long trail of white smoke, he had already dashed up to Kaunitz. The six streams of divine flames of the Earth's core were like six light pillars, encompassing Kaunitz's surroundings and extending out a distance of over 100 meters. Following the movement of his fingers, they swept out inch by inch. However, the speed at which they swept out was not at the speed of light. To Feng Xingjian, who was under the effects of boundaries negation, it was simply too slow. His right hand once again exploded out violently, and the viscous, poisonous blood gathered there, causing him to let out a stifled grunt. In an instant, the silver dragon brought out over 100 slashes, and they were like a drill that tapped onto Kaunitz's body crazily. The slashes caused his scales to be overturned, and his flesh and blood splattered as he fell to the ground, crying out in agony. Looking at Kaunitz, who was crying out crazily, Feng Xingjian said coldly, "Don't worry. In at most 2 years, I'll definitely chop off the first prince's head and let him accompany you." At this moment, there were still 12 seconds left in the boundaries negation. "There's still time. I'll peel off your turtle shell bit by bit before killing you." Chapter 150. Kaunitz, who was covered in blood and flesh, let out an agonizing cry. His six arms swung around crazily, and the divine flames of the Earth's core shot out in all directions, slicing through the ground and the trees, creating countless ravines that were several meters deep. Over 100 trees collapsed, and the others retreated in panic, looking at Kaunitz in shock. The prowess of the divine flames of the Earth's core was too strong. If not for the fact that he had encountered an opponent like Feng Xingjian who had such high speed, it would probably be difficult for even someone at the first transition to be his match. Feng Xingjian was too close and could only retreat explosively once again. If he were to suffer any serious injuries now, he might collapse completely. However, after this burst of attack, fresh blood spurted out once again from the wounds on Feng Xingjian's body. At the same time, his mind turned black, and he felt an intense pain. His consciousness started to blur, as if he would faint at any moment. However, Jack was not so lucky. His throat had been sliced open, and he was already waiting for death. Now that Kaunitz had gone crazy, and the divine flames of the Earth's core were crazily slashing at him, Jack was unable to dodge in time. He was slashed at the waist, and his stomach was sliced open, revealing a large area of charred internal organs. Blood foamed continuously from his mouth as he watched Fang Xingjian kill 2 knights at the pinnacle of the Earth's core consecutively, causing Kaunitz to go crazy like a dog. Seeing how Fang Xingjian dodged Kaunitz's final burst of attacks, Jack's eyes were filled with indignation. Why? Why are you still able to retaliate and kill at this stage? His eyes were in a daze, and the last thing that appeared in his mind were the figures of his wife and child. Wife, Alice, The next moment, his head tilted, and he finally died. Looking at the crazed Kaunitz, Fang Xingjian temporarily ignored him. After all, he could not get close to Kaunitz when he was in such a state. He might as well wait for Kaunitz to calm down and be out of strength before going up against him. Therefore, he turned to look at Rebecca, the last member of the opponent's battle force. On the other side, when Rebecca saw Kaunitz screaming hysterically and Cynthia and Zakov's corpses on the ground, she felt a boundless panic envelop her heart. Fang Xingjian's figure was like a nightmare that kept circling in her mind. The scene of him killing Cynthia and Zakov kept replaying in her mind. And at this moment, when Fang Xingjian looked over, she felt a boundless killing intent engulfing her heart, causing her body to tremble uncontrollably. This peak-level knight, who had always lived like a princess and relied on the resources of her family, was scared out of her wits. She screamed and quickly ran away. Seeing that Rebecca had escaped, Fang Xingjian wanted to chase after her, but he felt that he couldn't take another step. His poison was getting worse. Hence, he looked at the sword in his hand, and then at Rebecca, who had fled dozens of meters away in the blink of an eye. He suddenly swept out with his sword fingers. A 3-foot sword light swept out, and tens of streams of sword cheese soared up into the sky. Fang Xingjian performed the supreme Mistwind sword, and under the special effect of condensing sword cheese, tens of streams of sword cheese formed from the supreme Mistwind sword cut across space, instantly catching up to Rebecca, who was tens of meters away. Boom, 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 boom. It was as if tens of Stinger missiles had been fired consecutively. Rebecca's reduced force field was exploding crazily, but she was still sent rolling on the ground from the explosions. However, it was true that her physique and vitality were very strong. After rolling on the ground for a while, she jumped up again, spewing out a mouthful of blood. Her face was filled with terror, but her potential was unleashed. She dashed forward crazily like a dog, darting to a position 100 meters away from Fang Xingjian. Another tens of streams of sword cheese caught up to her. However, this had already exceeded the range where the sword cheese could condense. The tens of streams of sword cheese dissipated, and Rebecca took a long look at Fang Xingjian. Her eyes were filled with terror and vengeance, and then she quickly fled. Fang Xingjian wanted to continue chasing after her, but the moment he lifted his leg, he felt a wave of dizziness. His vision dimmed, and he could not even see Rebecca's silhouette clearly. His body swayed, and he fell to the ground. After all, he was already deeply poisoned. After performing a series of waves, mental cultivation method, and sword techniques, his stamina and mental energy were continuously depleted. The poisonous blood had entered his brain, and his injuries had become even more serious. He felt that his limbs were weak, as if he would collapse at any moment. Looking at Rebecca's fleeing silhouette, Fang Xingjian let out a cold snort, and then turned to look at Kaunitz. Kaunitz, who had been slashed to a bloody pulp, had already stopped going crazy. He looked at Fang Xingjian, his eyes filled with madness and bone-deep hatred. Kaunitz's expression was hideous. He opened his mouth and let out a cry that sounded like that of a wild beast on the verge of death. Fang Xingjian, kill me if you have the guts. If I don't die today, I'll never let you off. Your friends, your family, and everyone related to you will all have to die. Fang Xingjian said calmly, Don't worry. I'll come kill you after I rest for a while. On the other side, Rhea had completely fainted. Grand crawled over to her side and was performing emergency treatment. Tai Long, who was fully armored, and Wei Longzi, who was dressed in black robes, looked at Fang Xingjian with their eyes wide open, as if they were about to pop out. Right now, Fang Xingjian appeared to be very powerful, very mysterious, and also very unfamiliar. Despite being seriously injured and poisoned, he had still managed to kill 3 knights with a wave of his hand, seriously injuring Kaunitz and scaring off Rebecca. What kind of prowess was this? However, Fang Xingjian sat down on the ground, staring at Kaunitz. He felt increasingly dizzy, and his arms and legs gradually lost strength. He could only try his best to suppress the poison. At the same time, he took a look at his stats window. Having killed 2 senior knights consecutively, his experience had increased by quite a few notches. Cynthia and Zakov were not like Garcia's great warriors. They were at the very top amongst the Empire's first transition knights, and the experience they provided was simply too much. Moreover, he had been close to leveling up at level 14 with 87.9% experience. Now that he had reached level 17, it was as if he had increased by 3 levels, increasing his agility attribute by a total of 33 points. How terrifying was this increase in his abilities? It was impossible for ordinary first transition jobs to achieve this. Therefore, his attributes had now become: name Fang Xingjian, age 17, occupation Wind Shadow, sword, divinity level 17, 0.02% strength, 56 plus 5 agility, 167 plus 5 reaction, 55 endurance, 49 flexibility, 51. The attributes above come into effect once the Sonito Sword Zephyr Waves is activated. Due to perfect muscles, plus 5 in strength and agility, 10% of the endurance attribute. Nurturing sword techniques, 94 sets training, sword techniques, 12 sets supreme, Mistwind sword level 30 radiant light, sword technique level 6 genius swordsmanship, elementary survival instinct, internal healing, internal training, sword specialist, high agility motion vision, heightened reflexes, perfect muscles, elementary berserkness, unparalleled sword intent, 79 out of 100, 108, potential 11,000 point increase / day waves. Level 5 Sonito Sword, Zephyr, Waves Mental Cultivation, Method, Level 3, Universal, Sword Dominance Lunisolar. He had 172 points in his attributes. This meant that his agility attribute was even higher than a second transition job like Mamukia. After all, even at level 20, Mamukia only had 150 points in agility. Moreover, he did not have a skill like Boundaries Negation, so he could not unleash his full speed. Moreover, Fang Xingjian had the job specialty Single Sword World Subjugation. How fast could he be after performing Boundaries Negation at full power? Even Fang Xingjian himself was not sure. However, the others did not know this. On the other side, Mamukia, who had been hiding in the forest, said in a low voice, "He seems to be dying." Chapter 151. 1 kilometer away, a total of 4 knights were sprinting towards Fang Xingjian's location. Rhoda, who was in the lead, held a small silver spear in her hand and wore a determined expression. In order not to affect her battle, her long black hair had been tied up into a ponytail. Her night attire was filled with mud and bloodstains, but the damage and stains made her look even more valiant and heroic. As she advanced at a rapid speed, she lifted her head and looked at the sky, her eyes like a wolf staring at the burning and exploding fire clouds in the sky. As one of the top among all the students in Cursed Royal Academy, Rhoda had been fighting on the front lines for a long period of time. Countless exchanges with Garcia's great warriors had allowed her battle experience and will to fight to increase rapidly, and her abilities had improved greatly compared to before. Fang Xingjian, just you wait. I'll surpass you. Looking at the fire clouds in the sky, Rhoda said coldly, "Teacher Huang Lin has already exchanged blows with the other party, but it shouldn't be Mamukia. We'll have to be careful from now on. Mamukia is probably still hunting down our knights on the ground. Mamukia, if I can defeat you, if my void penetrative divine spear can pierce through you, then as an expert who also specializes in speed, I'll definitely be able to defeat Fang Xingjian, right?" As they spoke, the 4 of them had already rushed to the battlefield. On the other side, Mamukia, who had been hiding in the forest, said in a low voice, "He doesn't seem to be able to make it." Fang Qian asked, "It's a pity that there's no reduced force field for job transitions using magic prints, and there's no heaven's perception after the second transition. Do you feel anything?" Mamukia lifted his head and looked at the first prince and Huang Lin, who were still fighting fiercely with all sorts of flashes and explosions, blasting a hole in the clouds. He said, "I don't know. Heaven's perception also needs to be within 10 meters of the reduced force field. It's not convenient for you to expose yourself. Let me go up and take a look first." Heaven's perception meant that after second transition level 20, one would be able to sense the information transmitted by ether particles within the range of the reduced force field, such as temperature, light, the flow of the air, and the tremors of the ground. It would be like the mind's eye illuminating the area within 10 meters, seeing through all changes. After second transition, experts no longer needed to use their naked eyes to see in close combat. It was because they would not be able to do so in time and would not be able to see clearly. However, Heaven's perception could make up for this and replace his eyes. Although Fang Xingjian had unleashed an unprecedented battle prowess earlier on, both Fang Qian and Mamukia were still extremely confident. On one hand, it was naturally because everyone could see that Fang Xingjian was reaching his limit at this moment. On the other hand, it was naturally because he was only a first-job professional. In the end, there was still a huge gap between the first and second transitions. Heaven's perception was one of them, even though Mamukia had been injured by Fang Xingjian and had even been pushed back. Fang Xingjian had only managed to do so by gathering the combined reduced force fields of 6 people and the radiant light sword technique to catch him off guard. If not for Mamukia's astonishing intuition and being scared off by the first prince, he wouldn't have left at all. Therefore, when they saw the battle prowess displayed by Fang Xingjian, they were still confident and at ease. However, they had never expected that Fang Xingjian's job and job specialties would be so terrifying. They had also not expected that Fang Xingjian, with his heaven-defying abilities, had not yet reached the maximum level. He had even gone up 3 levels consecutively, increasing his agility attribute by 33 points. Therefore, Mamukia smiled and said, "Then I'll make a move first. You hold the line for me." After saying that, he trembled fiercely and the muscles all over his body expanded and contracted intensely. Layers of brown fur started to grow on the surface of his body. As the legacy of power came from those ferocious beasts and mutated humans, almost all of Garcia's warriors had the power of those ancient beasts in their bodies. And beastification was a skill that all of them knew how to use. However, beastification was, after all, a transformation of one's physique and a depletion of one's vital energy and blood. It was equivalent to harming oneself first before harming others. Many of Garcia's great warriors abused their beastification abilities wantonly and would die a sudden death at the age of 40. However, at Mamukia's level, he had a deeper understanding of ether particles after the second transition and had a better understanding of his body's condition. He started to pay attention to his health. Therefore, unless it was a critical moment, he would no longer use his beastification abilities. Amidst the intense changes, Mamukia grew taller and bigger. His mouth split open, revealing his fangs. He had turned into a human-shaped cheetah. After beastification, not only would the attributes of Garcia's people increase tremendously, they would also possess all sorts of special abilities. At this moment, all of Mamukia's attributes had increased by over 20 points, and his agility had even broken through to 170 points. At the same time, streams of light started to surround Mamukia, flashing incessantly. They were the waves of ether particles that were continuously stacking up. The greatest difference between the first transition and the second transition was that the first transition only used ether particles to transmit their powers. All sorts of attacks used their physical strength to exchange with ether particles, displaying all sorts of mysterious powers such as light, electricity, heat, magnetism, etc. After breaking through from level 19 to level 20 from the second transition, Second transition professionals would be able to borrow the powers of ether particles to attack, creating destructive powers that were like natural disasters like what Huang Lin and the First Prince had done. One used ether particles as a converter, while the other communicated with ether particles and could borrow their powers. Mamukia had borrowed the powers of ether particles and instantly formed an accelerating force field, using the powers of ether particles to accelerate himself like an electromagnetic cannon. However, Garcia did not have a legacy after all, and Mamukia's actions were extremely violent. There was a limit to the amount of time he could use it each day, or else his body would be damaged. Therefore, he had only used it now. In fact, if he had not encountered a freak like Fong Xingjian, Mamukia's speed would usually be sufficient to crush all knights. Grinning, Mamukia squatted down and pressed his hands on the ground, making a movement that was like the start of a race in the modern era. His legs swelled up intensely, and his muscles seemed to have expanded to twice their original size in an instant. The ground under his feet was instantly torn apart, turning into a huge crater. Countless rocks shot up into the sky. Rhoda, who was in the distance, had also arrived. She looked at Fong Xingjian, who was on the verge of collapse and covered in blood. She then looked at Mamukia, whose body had swelled up and seemed like he would explode at any moment. This is bad. He wants to kill Fong Xingjian. She let out an astonished cry and activated her void penetrative divine spear at full power. However, the distance was too far. She could only see Mamukia, but was unable to attack him. At the next moment, she turned her head abruptly, wanting to shout out something subconsciously. However, when she saw the scene before her, she was stunned and her eyes were wide open in disbelief. Mamukia's body disappeared abruptly. He had dashed out, and wherever he passed by, electricity would flash incessantly in the surroundings. It was the ether particles' acceleration force field that was giving him speed up. He had unleashed a power that surpassed 5 times that of supersonic speed. Before Wei Longzi and the others could react, he had already dashed up to Fong Xingjian. Wherever he passed by, it was as if the air had been pierced through. Sounds were stacked up and compressed together by his body at an extreme speed. There was no way for the sounds to reach the ears of others. The entire world seemed to have slowed down at this moment. Everyone seemed to have entered a state of stillness, completely stopping their movements. The dagger in Mamukia's hand brought along layers of reduced force field. Like a venomous snake, it twisted and pierced toward Fong Xingjian's arm. He had followed Fong Qian's instructions and wanted to capture Fong Xingjian alive. Therefore, he wanted to break one of Fong Xingjian's arms first. Wherever he passed by, ripples that could be seen by the naked eye would be created, leaving behind a long trail of white gas. It was as if he was a supersonic plane cutting across the sky. The speed of the dagger was extremely fast. Before anyone could see Mamukia, the dagger was already about to pierce Fong Xingjian's arm. Chapter 152. However, just as Mamukia's attack was about to chop off Fong Xingjian's right arm, a silver light suddenly lit up, blocking Mamukia's dagger at the very last moment. Boundaries negation was activated. There were 12 seconds left. Despite this, Mamukia's dagger was blocked off, but it still continued to sweep towards Fong Xingjian's neck at an extremely high speed after changing directions. It cut through his reduced force field, sliced through his flesh, and almost sliced off half of his neck. However, it was fortunate that Fong Xingjian's arteries and trachea were not severed. He still managed to survive. Fresh blood continued to flow out from Fong Xingjian's neck. Mamukia let out a strange laugh after charging out over 100 meters at high speed. Drawing a long arc, he once again dashed towards Fong Xingjian. Bang! Dang! Dazzling metallic sparks collided. Amidst the intense collisions that sent out layers of strong forces, Fong Xingjian was sent flying over 10 meters away. However, he managed to fend off Mamukia's attack once again. Don't move recklessly, lad. Otherwise, if I accidentally hack you to death, it'll be hard for me to explain myself. Amidst the violent collisions, Mamukia was like a shooting star, circling around Fong Xingjian and changing directions. Just as he said those two sentences, another 7 consecutive collisions rang out. Fong Xingjian held the silver dragon in one hand and the metal sword in the other. He was sent flying around like a spinning top, but he still managed to hold on. Pools of fresh blood continued to burst out from his wounds with each collision, causing him to look like he was on the verge of collapsing. This lad's reaction is really fast. Mamukia let out a cold laugh, and the muscles throughout his body swelled up. Strong gales exploded, and his body and dagger tore through the atmosphere. He circled around Fong Xingjian and continued to attack crazily. There were only 5 seconds left for boundaries negation. Just then, Fong Xingjian started to speak. As Mamukia slashed out time and time again, air currents exploded and sonic booms soared into the sky. His body trembled incessantly, and he was sent flying time and time again due to his lack of strength. However, his voice still rang out slowly in everyone's ears. Mamukia, haven't you noticed yet? Boom! The ground exploded from the stomping of Mamukia's beast claws, and the atmosphere screeched like a female ghost. With a dash, he had already appeared before Fong Xingjian. His dagger flashed with endless sparks as it clashed with Fong Xingjian's silver dragon, releasing crackling, explosive sounds. In the next second, he had already crossed paths with Fong Xingjian, following the explosive air currents. Your speed, already bang. The dagger and the silver dragon clashed together, and a violent force gushed out from Mamukia's body, causing Fong Xingjian to spurt out blood all over his body and fly tens of meters away. Mamukia stomped on the ground with his thighs, and the light waves from the ether particles around him flashed crazily. The acceleration field was activated, and he had already caught up to Fong Xingjian. Thrusting out his dagger once again, blood splattered out from between the two of them. There's nothing left. Mamukia let out a strange cry, his eyes bloodshot. He was filled with excitement from a massacre. It had been a long time since he had encountered such a tenacious prey that could even catch up to his attack speed. The dagger in his hand flashed, creating many afterimages, and with a strange whistling sound, it pierced towards Fong Xingjian from 8 different directions. Not as fast as me. In that instant, when Mamukia was less than half a meter away from Fong Xingjian, the distance was too close. Mamukia no longer had any chance to dodge. This was also the opportunity that Fong Xingjian had been waiting for. The silver dragon in Fong Xingjian's hand spread out several hundred sword shadows. It was as if a rain of swords had poured out within 0.1 seconds and then disappeared in an instant. The air was completely torn apart, and after a shocking pressure explosion, the two of them passed each other, standing there quietly without moving. Remaining time for boundaries negation, 0.5 seconds. In the next instant, Mamukia's head suddenly shot up into the sky, and the vital energy and blood that had been moving violently splattered out, as if a rain of blood had fallen. Mamukia's head fell to the ground, looking at Fong Xingjian in disbelief. His reduced force field vibrated the air, imitating his voice. To think that I would die in the hands of a first transition knight today. He looked at the huge wound on Fong Xingjian's neck. He had almost killed Fong Xingjian. He said in a regretful tone, "How fast was that attack of yours? 5 times that of supersonic speed? Or 6 times that of supersonic speed? It's a pity that my speed was still a little slower. Otherwise, with your reaction quality, you wouldn't have been able to react at all. It's a pity that if I was just a little faster, you'd already be dead." Sigh. Why is it that the Empire always has generations after generations of geniuses? But there are still many people in Garcia. They are improving with each generation. Even if I were to die, there would still be more geniuses appearing. Generation after generation, we can still... After using his reduced force field to vibrate the air for about a minute, Mamukia's eyes widened. He had died completely, displaying the strong vitality of a second transition professional. Fong Xingjian looked at Mamukia, then glanced in Countess's direction, a hint of regret flashing in his eyes. Right now, his vision seemed to have been severely affected, and he could not even see Fang Xingjian's face clearly. After killing Mamukia, Fang Xingjian leveled up once again. At the same time, an unprecedented comprehension appeared in Fang Xingjian's mind. His consciousness seethed, as if thousands of worlds were exploding within it. His mental cultivation method circulated rapidly until it reached a limit, shattering with a loud bang. The new mental cultivation method, after the mutation, finally appeared on his stats window. Universal Sword Dominance Lunisolar Level 3. 1 man and 1 sword, sweeping through the world. Only an invincible will could create invincible abilities. The cultivator's will was strong enough to transmit power through ether particles, turning it into a blade and sword, able to slash across space and perform sword arts. The actual effect was that the reduced force field would turn into ether sword ripples. Each level of the mental cultivation method would increase one's strength by 50%, and the slashing speed of the ether sword ripples would inherit the cultivator's attacking speed. Originally, the reduced force field could only unleash 50% of Fang Xingjian's strength. Moreover, the reduced force field could only be unleashed in a vague direction. He could push, twist, and compress, but he would definitely not be able to slash, or pierce through. Therefore, he could smash a person into a meat patty, but he would definitely not be able to slice them into two. And now, under the effects of the new mental cultivation method, the reduced force field had turned into ether sword ripples, becoming 150%, 50% for each level 3 of mental cultivation method, of his strength. Moreover, he could perform slashes, pierces, and other special attacks like a sword. Within 10 meters, he could use his will to form blades and swords, slashing across space with 150% of his strength. The slashing speed would also inherit the cultivator's attacking speed. How terrifying was that? How frightening was that? However, this series of battles had also caused Fang Xingjian's internal injuries and poison to worsen time and time again. Of course, after killing Mamukia, he had risen by 1 level, which had also increased his agility by another 11 points. His attacking speed had once again broken through the limits. Before he fainted, there was still the last 0.5 seconds of boundaries negation. Fang Xingjian only had time to tap out with his finger. Sonic booms and flames burst forth, and the ether sword ripples, which had surpassed 8 times that of supersonic speed, instantly formed in the air and slashed out toward Kaunitz. The air, which had been rubbing against each other at high speed, turned red and heated up, and even shot out streams of sparks. Strong gales whistled, turning into streams of heat currents that spread out in all directions. The invisible slash, which was 1.5 times that of supersonic speed and 8 times that of supersonic speed, was shot out fiercely. This was the first time he had displayed his terrifying strength before the world. Amidst Kaunitz's agonizing cries, under everyone's terrified gazes and a hint of regret, Fang Xingjian's vision turned black. He felt waves of intense pain coming from his brain, and he fainted completely. Chapter 153. Looking at Mamukia's corpse on the ground, Fang Qian revealed an expression of disgust. This trash can't even deal with a first transition knight? However, thinking of Fang Xingjian's explosive speed, Fang Qian could not help but admit that Fang Xingjian did indeed possess unbelievable battle prowess. But this speed of his can only be effective at close range. Thinking of the scenes of Fang Xingjian's battle earlier, Fang Qian was increasingly convinced of her judgment. She then looked at Fang Xingjian's collapsed state, stroked her chin, and said, "For now, we can't be sure if he has really lost his battle prowess and consciousness. And we can't be sure if he can still retaliate." After thinking for a while, out of caution, she decided to use long-distance attacks to capture Fang Xingjian. Thinking of the amazing speed that Fang Xingjian had to be able to kill a second transition professional who was at a higher level. Although it was Garcia's second transition, it was still extremely amazing. Thinking of this, An even greater interest flashed in her eyes. At the next moment, the prince all over Fang Qian's body twisted like tadpoles, then emitted waves of dim light, giving off a strange feeling of majesty, evil, terror, and holiness. In an instant, the prince all over her body turned into all sorts of gray light prints. Sensing the extremely abundant and greedy power in her body, Fang Qian opened her eyes, and streams of gray light burst out from them. This is the evil god's power. It was different from when they were in Demonic City. After arriving in Miracle World, they could summon the power of one of the 12 evil gods. With the enhancement of the evil god's power, the abilities of every Magic Prince warrior would improve by leaps and bounds. Although they could not be compared to those mages who could directly perform the evil god's power or cast sorcery, they were already close. As long as we complete the ultimate miraculous sorcery of the evil god's descent, the entire world will be under our rule. Each time she performed this extremely majestic power, Fang Qian could not help but be amazed at the greatness of the sorcery's power. At the next moment, strong gales started to surge around her. Countless sounds that sounded like the roars of dragons and tigers, or the bellows of a myriad of wild beasts, rang out from the wind. Fang Qian pointed her palm at Fang Xingjian. "Come here, my cousin." But in the next moment, she looked at the gray runes on her body with disbelief. She saw that the heretical god force was constantly collapsing and dissipating, and the gray light was slowly fading away. When the light completely disappeared, Fang Qian returned to her original appearance. As for the diabolic energy, it had already disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared. What happened? Why? Why did the demon marks and heretical god force fail? In her panic, she slowly retreated and left the battlefield. However, the scene of the evil god's power dissipating kept appearing in her mind. We must immediately report this to the Academy of Science. The heretical god force has retreated. This is something that has never happened before. Rhoda, who had just arrived from afar, saw this shocking scene. The tip of her nose was still dripping with sweat, and her cheeks were flushed red. Her mouth was constantly panting, showing how much energy she had used to rush here. Her mind replayed the scene that had just happened. Strong gales swept out, and loud whistles soared into the sky. At the end of the strong gales, Mamukia stood there in a daze. His head had already fallen to the ground, and fresh blood continued to spurt out from his swollen, beastified body, like a bright red fountain. The second transition Garcia's destined warrior. The Mamukia who possessed unparalleled speed. The Mamukia who had killed countless knights since the start of the war and had escaped from the hands of Conferred Knight. Had he died just like that? Rhoda looked at this scene with a complicated expression. It was only when she walked up to the corpse that she let out a sigh and looked at Fang Xingjian, who had fainted and was still bleeding incessantly. His body was covered in wounds, as if his neck had been completely slashed open. Give him treatment. Under her instructions, the knight next to her started to bandage up Fang Xingjian's injuries. Looking at Fang Xingjian, who had killed Mamukia, Rhoda's expression was extremely complicated. This was the man who had defeated her and humiliated her before countless people in the academy. However, now that she had seen him kill Mamukia, a strange feeling rose in her heart. It was admiration, or perhaps some other strange feeling. Looking at the unconscious Fang Xingjian, she finally got someone to treat him. She wanted to defeat Fang Xingjian, but not by stabbing him in the back. She wanted to fight him head-on, to defeat him fair and square. Just you wait. Although you've completely surpassed me now, I'll work hard to catch up to you. Don't die before I defeat you. She looked at Rhea and the others and asked, "How is she?" Rhea's chest had been pierced through by the divine flames of the Earth's core. Her lungs were almost completely burnt, and her heart had also stopped beating. Grand looked at Rhea in despair, as if he was in a daze. Rhoda shook her head. What on earth is going on? Countess continued to let out cries of pain. He had been hit by Fang Xingjian's final ether sword ripples. Although it had not killed him, it had chopped off all three of his arms on his right. The six-armed Azura had become a three-armed Azura. This had not only crippled his three arms, but it had also completely broken the balance of his body. He lay on the ground with a pale face, blood gushing out like a fountain. He could not exert any strength at all, much less move his body. Countess looked at his stats window. All of his attributes had been reduced by more than half. He was as good as a cripple, and his eyes were filled with madness and despair. Hearing Rhoda's question, he laughed in a low voice. Feng Xingjian? So what if he killed Mamukia? He was still fighting at full power when he was poisoned. The poison blood has long entered his brain, and he's dead. Even if he were to take the antidote now, he's still dead. Ha 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 ha, I'm crippled, but he's dead. In the end, I've still won. Trash. Wei Longzi lifted his head abruptly and glared at Countess, saying, Do you still have any sense of shame? Do you still have any bit of knight's glory? It's already unforgivable to poison a colleague behind his back. If it wasn't for Feng Xingjian killing Mamukia earlier, do you think you'd still be alive? We'd all die. Who needs him to save me? Green veins popped up on Countess's forehead, and his eyes were filled with brutality. He's a bastard who has no master or father. He goes against all morals. Compared to a bastard like him, I'd rather die in the hands of that black devil. You're unreasonable. Wei Longzi clenched his teeth and looked at Countess, saying word by word, Since that's the case, then you can go and die. As he spoke, he had already slashed out with his two swords, bringing along streams of electricity as they slashed toward Countess. However, just as his two swords were about to slash onto Countess's body, the spear in Rhoda's hands trembled and the void penetrative divine spear was activated. The small silver spear pierced through the spatial gaps, and the spearhead blocked Wei Longzi's attack, pushing him back. Following that, the spearhead flashed continuously, and a series of crisp sounds rang out from Tai Long's armor. He was also blocked. Rhoda bellowed, Stop! Are you guys crazy to kill your own people? Our own people? Has he ever treated us as his own people? Wei Longzi bellowed. He's the one who killed Rhea. He even wants to kill all of us to silence us. He's also the one who poisoned Feng Xingjian. He's a lunatic who lives off of us while secretly helping outsiders. Hearing this, Rhoda looked at the agitated Wei Longzi, Tai Long, and Grand. She shook her head and said, I know that you guys are very agitated. However, no matter what, we must wait for the commander to come and accept the association's trial before we can determine the truth of this matter. Saying that, she held her spear horizontally and placed it before Countess. It's impossible for me to believe your words alone. Before the association's trial, don't even think about touching him. However, don't worry. As long as what you've said is true, Countess will definitely receive the punishment he deserves. Moreover, he's already a cripple now. There's no need for you guys to be so anxious. Saying that, she threw another glance at Feng Xingjian and said to the person next to her, Has Feng Xingjian been poisoned? Go and search Countess. Help him bandage up his wounds and see if he has the antidote. Countess was unable to move and allowed them to search him. However, he smiled and looked at the three of them with a provocative gaze. Intense madness and despair flashed in his eyes. For a genius like him, his greatest value had always been his talent. Now that half of it had been crippled by Feng Xingjian, the despair and madness in his heart blazed up like oil being poured onto a fire. Wei Longzi clenched his teeth tightly, and his hands were clenched so tightly that they turned pale. The hatred in his heart burned up like oil being poured onto a raging fire. Just then, a loud sound rang out in the sky, and the fire clouds started to dissipate. Chapter 154. The fire clouds exploded and once again formed the first prince's body. The gigantic sword force in Huang Lin's hand had already disappeared, and his entire body was charred black. The first prince's grand solar unbounded flames had burned up all the ether particles in and out of his body temporarily, and he was unable to perform any extraordinary powers. He plunged toward the ground. However, when he was in midair, he finally broke through the anti-magic zone of the great solar unlimited flames and came into contact with the ether particles in the space. He swung the long sword in his hand, and streams of sword force were formed again. Ha ha ha! Huang Lin, are you still not going to surrender? In the sky, fiery light beams continued to shoot out from the first prince's fingertips. Huang Lin continued to step on streams of sword force, dodging the rays as if he was walking on flat ground. Although his speed could not match up to the rays, he was always able to dodge and advance by observing his opponent's finger movements. However, the divine flames of the Earth's core that the first prince was performing could not be mentioned in the same breath as Countess's. Streams of crimson-red rays shot out like machine guns, and they could even twist and curve, wrapping around Huang Lin like a net of light. Huang Lin's space to dodge also continued to shrink. Anyone with a discerning eye could tell that the situation was extremely disadvantageous to him. Countess smiled and Rhoda frowned as she asked hesitantly, "That's the first prince?" Countess smiled and said, "That's right. You should know what to do now, right? A bunch of stubborn old fellows in the academy want to go against the future ruler of the empire. They really don't know what they're talking about." However, at the next moment, Countess's expression suddenly stiffened, and the roars of a myriad of beasts rang out. From the east, Jackson soared into the sky and punched out. It was as if the world was changing. In that instant, countless transparent, ferocious beasts charged toward the first prince like a myriad of beasts. This was his strongest killing technique, the myriad beasts' divine fist. It was an ultimate killing technique that allowed him to inherit the powers of each ferocious beast he killed. From the west, a myriad of golden light pierced through the sky, slicing through the atmosphere. It was as if countless long swords were rippling around the first prince. This was the killing technique, Solar Sword Disc. It was a killing technique that refracted sunlight through ether particles, turning endless sunlight into laser cannons. In the north, a crimson moon slowly rose. In an instant, it seemed as if countless illusions flashed before everyone's eyes. The killing technique, Blood Moon, accumulated endless auras of vengeance, poison, vengeance, and bloodlust to carry out mental attacks. The first prince narrowed his eyes and said solemnly, "Curse Jackson, Green Jade's Edward, and Mongol's Olivier." These three people were the headmasters of the three academies who had come to reinforce the Western Garrison Army this time around. Other than Jackson, who was at second transition level 26, the other two were also at second transition level 25. If the first prince were here in person, he would not be afraid of the three of them joining forces. He could even take them down one by one and suppress them. However, the current flame clone was merely a clone that the first prince had created using the Devil's Note as his main body. He was not a match for the three of them if they joined forces. Excellent, excellent, excellent. To think that the three of you would be mobilized just to deal with the aboriginals of Garcia. It seems that my younger brother's control over the great western region is even deeper than I had imagined. In the west, the source of the myriad of golden light was an old man who was leaning on a walking stick. It was Green Jade Royal Academy's headmaster, Edward. He mumbled, "First Prince, now that Garcia has taken over the coastal areas of the great western region, killing and arson, raping and pillaging, committing all sorts of crimes. The commoners have no way of making a living. This is not the time for us to have internal strife." Jackson let out a cold snort and said, "For the sake of a prefectural champion, they've schemed and sent out 3 senior knights, even personally using their clones. They're really too shameless." In the north, there was an old man wrapped in layers of bandages, revealing only a pair of demonic green eyes. It was Mongol Royal Academy's headmaster, Oliver. He said calmly, "George Creek, aren't you stretching your hands too far? I don't care if you murder students from other regions, but if you're going to deal with the Great Western region, we won't tolerate you." 3 headmasters and 3 confer knights. Although they were not as strong as the first prince, they did not lack the courage to stand before him. If they did not even have this bit of courage, they would not have been able to become second transition conferred knights. Moreover, they were only dealing with a clone. As for the first prince's actual body, there was naturally Governor Devitt, who was also a second transition level 29 character, to deal with him. The first prince let out a cold laugh, and in the next moment, his body dashed down abruptly, heading toward Fong Xingjian and Countess like a fiery meteor. He wanted to bring both Countess and Fong Xingjian away in one go. "How dare you? How dare you? Stop it!" 3 thunderous bellows exploded, and a myriad of galloping beasts came crashing over with a power that could overturn rivers and seas. Golden sword light shot out like countless laser cannons, heading toward the first prince. The blood moon rose into the sky, and there seemed to be countless traces of blood in the air. The first prince let out an astonished cry, and his flame clone continued to disintegrate. He was being attacked at the consciousness level. Helpless, he was unable to bring the others away. His entire body turned from crimson red to crimson white, leaving behind a long trail of fire as he cut across the sky and left. Green Jade Academy's headmaster, Edward, sighed. "The Devil's Note is impervious to all arts and is indestructible. Without divine-level means, there's no way to destroy it. One can only suppress it." Mongol Academy's headmaster, Oliver, let out a cold snort and said, "If it wasn't for the legacy of the ancient path of hell, how could he possibly be so arrogant and despotic, openly attacking and framing an official knight? He's disregarding the country's laws." Jackson and Edward smiled bitterly and did not reply. Things like the country's laws could be used to restrict ordinary people or knights. However, it was too difficult to say these things in front of conferred knights or even divine-level experts. Which second transition expert did not have astonishing wills, did things their own way, and had the world move according to their will? To expect such people to abide by the laws of commoners was like wanting sharks to queue up for a meal. It was too difficult. To be able to rely on the royal family and the association's powers to suppress all the conferred knights, getting them to stand guard over an area and serve the empire was already an extremely difficult feat. The 3 of them, as well as Huang Lin, came to Fong Xingjian's side. Looking at this student who was seriously injured, all of their gazes were filled with admiration. Jackson threw a glance at Huang Lin and asked, "Are your injuries all right?" I'm fine. Huang Lin waved his hand and started to check up on Fong Xingjian's body. After a while, he said, "It's all right. These are all superficial wounds. This lad's vitality is astonishing. With his elementary berserkness physique as a foundation, as long as he didn't die on the spot, he should be fine after recuperating for a period of time. However, there's still some toxins in his organs. We'll need to get a doctor to do a thorough check." Edward, who had a head full of white hair and wrinkles, twitched his lips and said, "Is this how you guys protect your genius disciples? If it were in our Green Jade Academy, a genius disciple like him would have long been equipped with Remain's divine weapons. He wouldn't be as seriously injured as he is now." Huang Lin let out a cold laugh and said, "Old man, which lad in your academy is able to fight against Garcia's destined warrior? If not, then stop bragging. It's useless no matter how many divine weapons you bring." Edward shook his head angrily and left. "Humph, don't be happy too early. There are also a few good seedlings in our Green Jade Academy. We still don't know who will emerge victorious in this regional selection." Oliver, who was wrapped up in countless white bandages, looked at Countess with an eerie gaze and said calmly, "Although we can't suppress that page of the Devil's Note, we can teach this lad a good lesson. It'll be enough to make George suffer. He'll have to pay a hefty price to change the signer of the Devil's Note." Countess let out a cold laugh in disdain, but Oliver sent out a slap and sent Countess flying. Hearing Countess's agonizing cries, Oliver said coldly, "Lad, don't think that no one can touch you just because you're an aristocrat. After I send you to the place, I'll first break the tendons in your arms and legs, completely crippling you. And when the association's verdict is out, I'll also apply to take action personally. You'll know what true hell is like." Countess's expression changed, and he glared fiercely at Oliver like a wild beast struggling on its deathbed. "You can't do this. This is a lynching. Before the association's verdict is issued, you can't do anything to me." "Can't do anything to me?" Oliver let out a cold laugh and struck out with his claws, breaking off Countess's remaining 3 arms. Even his muscles, bones, and tendons were twisted into a mess. In addition to Countess's 3 arms, which had been chopped off by Feng Xingjian, he was completely finished. When Oliver was young, he had offended the aristocrats due to his lack of talent. As a result, over 80% of his skin had been burned. Therefore, he had always been wrapped in bandages and had never shown himself to others. It was also because of this experience that he hated the aristocrats. He instead had a good impression of geniuses like Feng Xingjian, who were born as commoners. Looking at Countess, who was lying on the ground and crying out in agony, Oliver broke into a cruel, cold smile. As for Jackson and the other 2, they acted as if they had not seen anything and continued to instruct their subordinates. In their eyes, Countess was already a dead man through and through. Just like that, Feng Xingjian and Countess were transported by the knights to a nearby base. What followed was naturally all sorts of treatments, and then the Knight Association's investigation. Although they had Wei Longzi and the others' testimonies, there were still many things that needed to be verified slowly. It was impossible to believe whatever a few knights said. Most importantly, there was still a lot of physical evidence, as well as waiting for the person involved, Feng Xingjian, to wake up. However, no matter who it was, they would all look at Countess with contempt and disdain. A knight who had joined forces with the elders of other clans to attack his own people in the midst of a war would definitely have a bad reputation. Even the first prince, who is thousands of leagues away, would be affected. 3 days later, the Trija clan's leader rushed over. When he saw Countess lying on the sickbed, he immediately slapped him to the ground. However, the length of time that Feng Xingjian had been unconscious was much longer than what everyone had expected. Chapter 155. By the time Feng Xingjian woke up, a month had already passed. He was currently lying on the sickbed in Cursed Academy. When he opened his eyes, it was still pitch black. The doctor stood next to him, looking at Feng Xingjian with a gaze filled with pity. "I'm sorry. The poison from eternal wounds has been delivered to your brain through your blood vessels. Although the effects have been alleviated after the antidote diluted it, it has still damaged the areas in your brain that are related to your vision. You'll probably be unable to see for a very long period of time." Lilia grabbed the doctor by his collar and lifted him up, saying furiously, "What do you mean by he can't see? Are you saying that teacher will go blind? How did you guys treat him? After spending so much time and money, this is the result?" "All right, Lilia." Huang Lin stared at the doctor and asked, "May I ask if there's any possibility of him recovering?" The doctor threw a fearful glance at Lilia and said, "I'm sorry. Things in the brain are too complicated. It's hard to say. He might not be able to see for several decades, or he might suddenly recover on a certain day. It's really hard to say." Huang Lin asked, "Will it work if it's a speciality related to regeneration?" "I'm afraid it'll be very difficult as well. Ordinary specialties related to regeneration and healing are all targeted at external injuries, physical injuries, and some internal injuries. There doesn't seem to be any specialties that can regenerate the nerves in the brain." The doctor was still conversing with the others, but Feng Xingjian's expression was very calm. He flicked his fingers, and streams of wind shot out in the direction of his fingers. They were like miniature sword cheese, hitting the walls and releasing pitter-patter sounds. The doctor left, and Huang Lin walked over. Looking at Feng Xingjian, who was lying on the sickbed, his eyes were filled with desolation, pity, fury, and many other complicated emotions. Looking at how Feng Xingjian kept on flicking his fingers and hitting the walls, Feng Xingjian let out a sigh. Feng Xingjian's will was stronger than he had imagined. After knowing that he had lost his sight, he did not show any signs of disappointment or despair. Instead, he thought of all sorts of methods. The current echo detection was one of them. However, there was a limit to the speed at which sound traveled. Even if Feng Xingjian could sense the presence of his opponent through sound waves, it would be useless as long as the opponent exceeded the speed of sound. Lilia, who was at the side, had already pounced on him. She wrapped her arms around Fang Xingjian's waist and looked at Fang Xingjian with reddened eyes. He recalled how high-spirited Fang Xingjian had been back in the academy. He had single-handedly challenged the prefectural champions, defeated the instructor, and then pursued Mukia over 1,000 miles, killing the destined warrior who had gone through the second transition. But now, because of a noble like Countess, because of the first prince's scheme, such a genius had actually lost his sight. How great of a blow would it be for a warrior to be blinded? She could not imagine how much pain Fang Xingjian must be feeling right now. She wiped her eyes and tried her best to speak in a calm tone. "Teacher, you're fine. You'll definitely get better. I'll definitely take good care of you." Looking at the expressionless Fang Xingjian and the teary-eyed Lilia, Huang Lin let out a sigh and said, "Lilia, go out for a while. I have something to discuss with Xingjian." Lilia hugged Fang Xingjian tightly and did not move. Fang Xingjian patted her on the shoulder and said, "It's fine. You could go out first." Seeing Lilia leave, Huang Lin let out a sigh and said, "Brain injuries are very troublesome. If you want to recover, it'll all depend on luck. However, for people like us who have extraordinary powers, we don't necessarily need to rely on our eyes to fight." The Empire's legacies had very comprehensive records regarding second transition conferred knights. There were a total of 10 levels from level 20 to level 29 for the second transition. From level 19 to level 20, all the way to level 28, attempting to reach level 29, there were barriers between each level that were difficult to break through. There were a total of 10 barriers, and they were known as the 10 heavenly barriers. Not only was it difficult to break through the 10 heavenly barriers, but there was also the risk of becoming a vegetable or an idiot if one failed. The first stage of the 10 heavenly barriers was heaven's perception. It was also a hurdle that must be overcome in order to break through from level 19 to level 20. In order to attain heaven's perception, one's consciousness needed to be connected to ether particles, allowing humans to break free from the restraints of their brains in battle. Their ability to calculate, remember, and react would all increase rapidly. Ether particles contain all sorts of information. As long as one is able to sense ether particles and take the initiative to receive the information transmitted from them, there will be nothing that cannot be seen within 10 meters of the reduced force field. It will be even clearer than what one can see with the naked eye. This is heaven's perception. Therefore, no matter what kind of high-speed attack Confer Knights are faced with, they will at least be able to sense it within 10 meters. At the same time, they will be able to receive information from ether particles, which is equivalent to having an additional sensory organ. Their comprehension of strength will also be outstanding, and it will be equivalent to having their talent increased by more than one-fold. In the Empire's Knight legacies, the first transition would require the fulfillment of attributes, waves, mental cultivation method, techniques, and other conditions before being completed in a secret realm. The second transition would require one to attain heaven's perception. Only then would one be able to complete the second transition in a sacred land that was one level higher than a secret realm. Huang Lin said calmly. However, to attain heaven's perception is not something that can be done easily. Countless knights have failed at this stage. Clan elders like Rebecca and experienced instructors in the academy. There are many who do not even dare to attain heaven's perception. Therefore, they do not even dare to participate in the regional selection and can only spend their entire lives in circles in the first transition. This is because there are dangers involved. Once one is unable to accept the information from ether particles, one might become an idiot, or one might end up in a vegetative state with their brain and consciousness flowing into ether particles. The entire process is filled with trepidation and danger. Therefore, many knights do not have the courage to take this step. That's why it's called the 10 heavenly barriers. Most knights would pass the regional selection and then make use of the Regional Royal Academy's resources to strive for heaven's perception, which was to sense ether particles. However, Fang Xingjian was now attempting to sense ether particles directly and cursed with his own abilities. Fang Xingjian said, "Teacher, Please teach me how to attain the 10 heavenly barriers, how to attain heaven's perception. The 10 heavenly barriers is to continuously sense the information from ether particles, continuously improving the human body, changing one's intrinsic qualities, and evolving continuously. Each stage is extremely dangerous. If it's light, one might lose their memories, or if it's severe, one might become a lunatic. However, it can be said that it's very difficult, yet also very simple. There are only 8 words. Heart like a newborn baby will like steel. Huang Lin mumbled to himself. When we communicate with humans and animals, it's all through sounds, gestures, and various actions. However, these are all sentient beings. Ether particles did not have any sentience, and he was unable to sense them with his 5 senses. The only thing that could sense him was the human heart. Therefore, in order to sense the information from ether particles, one would need to move unintentionally to sense the natural changes in space. Experienced killers would be able to sense the presence of killing intent. Animals would be able to sense the arrival of natural disasters. And even if you stared at a small bird, you might be able to scare it away. These were all unintentionally sensing the information from ether particles. The first transition required one to sense the existence of ether particles, while the second transition required one to receive the information from ether particles. However, the crux of the matter was unintentionally. In order to sense the true meaning unintentionally, one would need to have an extremely high mental state. One would also need to have an indomitable will, so that one would not get lost in it and become an idiot or a vegetable. From Fang Xingjian's understanding, this was like how the eyes could receive electromagnetic waves like visible light and receive information. The second transition required one to develop the brain, allowing the brain to receive waves like ether particles and receive the information from them. Huang Lin looked at Fang Xingjian's face, which had his eyes closed, and said emotionally, "There are too many temptations in our lives. You must clear these distracting thoughts, possess a heart of innocence that is as clear as a mirror, and be in a state of extreme tranquility. Only then will you be able to sense the existence of ether particles. Only by truly sensing ether particles would one have the chance to step into the second transition and control oneself freely. Only then would one's martial techniques become martial arts, truly transcending mortality and entering sainthood." Chapter 156. Huang Lin looked at Fang Xingjian and said, "Under normal circumstances, only those with mental cultivation methods at level 7 and above will be able to come into contact with heaven's perception and think about how to sense ether particles. However, with your current condition, it'll probably be even harder for your mental cultivation method to level up." As he spoke, he sighed once again. Even if he were to attain heaven's perception, he would only be able to sense the situation within the range of the reduced force field. He would still not be able to sense the environment beyond this range. To a knight or a conferred knight, this was a huge flaw. Of course, there was another way. Huang Lin said, "During this period of time, you should first learn some relevant knowledge. When I'm back, I'll protect you in your attempts. I'm going to look for someone during this period of time." His expression was solemn as he said, "Among the 10 divine level experts in the Empire, the only one who specializes in healing, the Holy Orison. I'll look for him and hope that he can treat your eyes." What kind of price would he have to pay to ask a divine level expert to treat him? Just by thinking about it, Fang Xingjian knew that it was impossible for a divine level expert like this to treat others casually. It was because even the Empire's king would have to treat such a person with respect and not force him. How could he possibly treat Fang Xingjian casually? However, Huang Lin still smiled, even though his smile was filled with bitterness. 10 years ago, he had already seen a genius fall before his eyes. He had questioned the authorities and caused a huge ruckus in the imperial capital, but there had been no results. He had then left quietly, hiding in the academy. However, now that something similar had happened once again, he would not allow himself to fail again. "Xingjian, your talent should shine brightly and leave your name in history. Your future definitely shouldn't be filled with darkness. I might gradually be unable to guide you in your sword arts. But there are some things that these old bones of mine can still put up a fight for. Huang Lin left, but Fang Xingjian still had to continue with his cultivation. His eyes were filled with darkness, causing him to be unable to see anything. This was also the first time he experienced how troublesome life would be after losing his vision. At the same time, he started to understand his new mental cultivation method curiously, as well as the power it could use, ether sword ripples. After he had killed Mimukya, Fang Xingjian's attack speed had risen by a whole 183 points. What kind of concept was this? Coupled with his single sword world subjugation, his maximum speed after executing boundaries negation was 8 times that of sound. This sword ripple could reach a maximum of 5 times his strength, and his current maximum speed of 8 times the speed of sound. How terrifying was this? He gave it a try in the room. Of course, he didn't dare to use his full strength. Even so, he was amazed. This ether sword ripples are really powerful. After testing out the ether sword ripples, he started to get used to the blind training. A breeze brushed past Fang Xingjian's fingertips. The wind traversed through space and directly blew onto the table, touching the cup. The slight sound allowed Fang Xingjian to sense the existence of an object. However, in the next moment, the overly strong wind caused the cup to fall to the ground and shatter into pieces. Lilia hurriedly walked in and swept away the broken pieces of the teacup. "Teacher, do you want some water? Let me pour it for you." Taking over Lilia's teacup, Fang Xingjian did not say anything and just drank the water quietly. Lilia said, a little worried, "Teacher, don't be anxious. Take it slow. You'll definitely be able to do it." She was really worried that he would lose his confidence and become dispirited. After all, not everyone would be able to accept the fact that they were blind, especially when this person was a genius. Fang Xingjian shook his head calmly and said, "It's fine. After losing my sight and being surrounded by darkness, I feel that my spirit is even more peaceful and relaxed." He turned to look at Lilia and asked, "Has the war ended?" Lilia nodded and said, Garcia's people have all retreated. In the end, the 3 headmasters and the western garrison's general joined forces and wiped out their main forces. The remaining survivors all jumped into the sea and escaped. Fang Xingjian nodded. He recalled that he had buried many corpses of Garcia's great warriors. It was a pity that he was blind and the incident had happened a long time ago. He could only try to recall them slowly and see if he could remember them. Fang Xingjian then asked, "What about Kaunitz? How is he?" Lilia clenched her teeth and said hatefully, "He's currently locked up in a prison in the city and is being interrogated by the people sent by the association." Lilia naturally hated this person who had hurt Fang Xingjian to the extreme. If it was not because the association was still protecting him and others were not allowed to interfere, she would have gotten her father to think of a way to kill him. However, her father had also said that even the first prince would be in trouble for something like this. Kaunitz himself would definitely be dead meat. Fang Xingjian nodded. Kaunitz had committed a great crime. Even if he had the protection of Tresia and the first prince, now that there were witnesses and material evidence, he would definitely be dead meat. As for Rebecca, she was currently wanted by the association. However, she was after all a level 19 knight at the pinnacle of their level. If she was bent on hiding, it would not be easy to capture her. As for Fang Xingjian, if his eyes were not taken into account, he would be almost unrivaled amongst those in the first transition. His sneak attacks from the ether sword ripples would even have a chance to threaten a level 20 conferred knight. From now on, he only needed to continue to improve his universal sword dominance lunisolar mental cultivation method, cultivate his sword arts, strengthen his unparalleled sword intent, attain perfection in his effulgence weapon, and find an opportunity to level it up to level 19. With that, his abilities would once again experience a breakthrough. However, the fact that he had lost his sight had messed up all his plans. Currently, the most important thing for Fang Xingjian was to get used to the situation after losing his sight. At the start, he had still used the supreme mist-wind sword's method to sense his surroundings through sword cheese, wind, and sounds. This would at least allow him to get used to his daily life. However, if he wanted to go all out in battle, he would still need to reach the realm of heaven's perception. As for the treatment of a divine-level expert, he was not used to placing his future in the hands of others. After a while, Lilia walked in with a man dressed in military uniform. The man bowed to Fong Xingjian and said, "Hello, Xingjian. I'm Killet from the Western Garrison." "Hello, what's the matter?" Fong Xingjian said calmly. Streams of air currents continued to form in his hands, helping him to sense his surroundings. Killet said, "Xingjian, I'm really grateful to you for killing Mamukia. 6 of my comrades died in his hands." Saying this, a hint of sorrow appeared on Killet's determined face. Mamukia's speed was unrivaled, and he was also at the second transition level. To many knights, he was a nightmare. Killet had once watched as his comrades were killed one by one under Mamukia's pursuit. If not for the fact that reinforcements had arrived in time, he might have died as well. There was still a deep scar on his chest, which had been left behind by Mamukia. He hated Mamukia to the core, but Mamukia's unrivaled speed and beast-like instincts allowed Mamukia to always avoid being surrounded and attacked, continuing to hunt down the Empire's knights. Therefore, when he found out that Mamukia had died in Fong Xingjian's hands, he was extremely agitated. Therefore, when he found out that Fong Xingjian had woken up, he rushed over at the first instance. "Xingjian, the general admires you a lot for your contributions. If it wasn't for the fact that you've yet to recover from your serious injuries, he would really want to recruit you into the army." Saying this, Killet looked at Fong Xingjian with a regretful gaze. A genius who had lost his sight could be said to be half-crippled. Even if he managed to attain heaven's perception, he would still have a huge flaw that was hard to avoid. Saying this, Killet took out a list and said, "Reward or something that His Majesty the King has personally announced. However, the general knows that you're in need of help at this moment. Therefore, he asked me to give you this list. As long as our Western Garrison has it, you can ask for it." Chapter 157. Taking a look at the list, Killet suddenly reacted and said, "I'm sorry. Let me read it out to you." Fong Xingjian shook his head and said, "Do you have Seism steel?" "Seism steel?" Killet gave it some thought. Fong Xingjian was now blind, so defense was more important than offense. It was also true that he would need something like Seism steel to make protective gear. Therefore, he nodded and said, "How much do you need? Or we can give you the finished Seism steel protective gear." Fong Xingjian shook his head once again and said, "I don't need protective gear. I only want Seism steel. I need about 100 kilograms. Can you guys give it to me?" He had roughly estimated that if he wanted to complete his high-frequency effulgence weapon, he should be able to do so by adding in 100 kilograms of Seism steel. 100 kilograms? Killet frowned. Seism steel was something that could only be obtained through a large amount of mining, excavation, extraction, smelting, and other means. 100 kilograms was almost half of what the Western Garrison Army could obtain in a year. Moreover, just a little bit of Seism steel could be added into protective gear to increase its resistance to earthquakes. How many armors could be made with 100 kilograms of Seism steel? Killet could not think of what Fong Xingjian could use these things for. However, although his eyes were filled with doubt, when he thought of the attack Fong Xingjian had used to kill Mamukia, he still nodded and said, "If it's 100 kilograms of Seism steel, there's no problem. But if you want so much, I'm afraid we can only give you 100 kilograms of Seism steel and nothing else. Are you sure you want this?" Fong Xingjian smiled and nodded, saying, "That's right. When will you guys be able to bring it to me? The sooner, the better." "Xingjian, don't worry. I'll get someone to send it over in, at most, 7 days." Saying this, Killet suddenly changed the topic and said, "What happened earlier was the Army's compensation and reward for you. On a personal level, I'm also very grateful for what you've done for the Great Western region." With that, he bowed deeply toward Fong Xingjian and continued, "I know how great of a blow it is for a cultivator to be blind. You must get through it. If there's anything you need my help with, Feel free to look for me anytime. After Killet left, Lilia finally could not hold it in any longer and asked, Teacher, why do you need the Seism steel? Actually, although the Jinchi army is just a local army, they have a lot of good stuff. Fang Xingjian shook his head. I already have too many things on hand. It's enough that I can put all of them to good use. The most important thing is still my eyes. With that, he slashed out with ether sword ripples and activated the supreme mist wind sword. The breeze in his hand suddenly sped up and became a gust of wind, blowing all the cups, plates, tables, and chairs around him to the ground. It was like a radar. Under the strong wind, all the objects that the wind touched would emit an echo. This allowed Fang Xingjian to vaguely sense the existence of various substances around him. At the same time, Fang Xingjian also roughly calculated the amount of physical strength that the ether sword ripples would deplete. If he were to perform sword ripples with his current peak physical strength, he would be able to perform about 500 streams of ether sword ripples. Once he used up all of them, he would probably be completely drained of energy and lose his battle prowess. Thus, he swept his sword fingers and began to practice with his hands in place of swords. If it's under the strong wind, I'll have a rough idea of the surroundings. Next is the breeze. I need to be more sensitive. A sense of urgency kept on forcing Fang Xingjian to move forward. After the end of the year, Garcia had attacked. Fang Xingjian had been in pursuit and had been unconscious for a month. There were only 4 months left to the regional selection. If he were to miss this year's regional selection, he would have no hope of participating in the national selection next year. To him, who was only left with 4 years to live, this would mean that he would never have any hope of participating in the national selection, becoming a royal knight, or passing through the third transition. This was something that he could not accept. It was because he wanted to seek revenge, to go back and stand before Fang Clan's old granny, Li Shuanghua, and to find out what had happened to his mother. Therefore, he needed to have the power to go up against a divine-level expert. I'll continue to cultivate my attributes, waves, sword intent, and effulgence weapon as usual. But at the same time, I must first familiarize myself with using the wind to sense things. After this is done, I'll think of a way to sense ether. Just as Fang Xingjian was quietly cultivating and familiarizing himself with the steps after losing his sight, an important meeting was being held elsewhere. Everyone should be aware of the problem with next year's national selection and the changes in this year's regional selection, right? Cursed Royal Academy's upper echelon were seated at the huge round table. Headmaster Jackson sat at the head of the table, reading through a report. Half a month ago, the imperial capital had issued a new government decree. In order to encourage the nation's martial arts, it was to reward those who had performed outstandingly in building up the country's knights. For next year's national selection and this year's regional selection, both the participants and the academies they represented would receive even more rewards. Firstly, the winner of the national selection would receive a set of divine equipment. What was a divine equipment? Divine equipment referred to divine remains equipment. It was a super weapon forged from the bones of a divine-level expert. As for divine equipment, it was forged from the bones of an entire divine-level expert, together with countless rare treasures, such as boots, cloaks, armor, helmets, etc. They formed a set of divine equipment. Such a set of divine equipment was forged through ingenious means, retaining 30% of the divine-level expert's powers. This meant that whoever wore this set of divine remains equipment would be able to unleash 30% of the divine-level expert's powers. What kind of terrifying thing was that? Therefore, once this news was spread, it shook the world. Countless knights and conferred knights moved upon hearing the news, and even a few divine-level experts turned their gazes over. It was because divine equipment sets were too powerful and too valuable, attracting the greedy gazes of countless people. Next would be the 2nd to 10th place. Each of them would receive a level 29 superior remains divine weapon. Although this was also very powerful, it was still far from being comparable to a divine weapon set equipment. Next would be the regional selection. In each of the Empire's 8 regions, The person who came first in the regional selection would be able to obtain a set of level 29 superior remains divine weapon. It was a divine weapon forged from the complete corpse of conferred knight, and it would possess 50% of a level 29 conferred knight's powers. This was another prize that would drive people crazy. The 2nd to 10th place in the regional selection would also be able to freely choose a superior remains divine weapon from the inventory. All the participants who passed the regional selection, representing the Royal Academy, would all be able to receive an increase in their budget starting from the next year. The 1st to 10th place would receive an increase of between 100% and 10%. Moreover, the regional selection's 1st place would receive the royal killing technique as a reward. This caused countless people to go crazy. The headmaster sighed and said, "Although I don't really agree with such a method of using material resources to stimulate the Empire's knights for a short period of time, I must say that the prizes this time around are too generous. Even I'm a little jealous. However, our competition is also very intense. Does anyone have any thoughts? Feel free to speak your mind." Just as the headmaster finished speaking, a sharp and thin voice said, "In the past half a year, in order to nurture Fang Xinjian, we've spent too much resources, even taking away the cultivation materials of the other prefectural champions. Now that Fang Xinjian is crippled, is there no one who should take responsibility?" Chapter 158. Jackson frowned and looked at the person who had spoken. It was the chief instructor of the archery department. He had long black hair, looked thin and pale, and looked like a legendary elf, Edgar. Edgar was the son of the previous headmaster. He was 40 years old this year. Although he had not successfully sensed ether particles, participated in the regional selection, and passed the 2nd transition, he had been known as a genius when he was young. He was now an experienced 1st transition knight. 5 years ago, he had secretly seized the cultivation materials of the students for his own cultivation due to a deficit in the academy's resources. He was discovered by Jackson and was almost expelled from the academy. It was only because the former dean had pleaded for him many times and filled his own pockets to make up for the deficit that he finally let him go. Even so, Edgar was still filled with enmity towards Jackson. This was because Edgar was a person who valued his own reputation and faced the most. Now that such a matter had been exposed by the headmaster, he was so ashamed that he wanted to die and almost committed suicide. Even if they were stopped from committing suicide, they did not return to the academy for more than half a year. After returning to the academy, they would often live in seclusion, gradually fading out of the public sight. They did not have the face to appear in front of the public at all. For a person who valued face so much, to suffer such a blow. It could be said that he had always been thinking of ways to take revenge on Jackson, but due to Jackson's powerful strength, he had always hidden his intentions and did not take any actual action. This time, for some unknown reason, he looked at Jackson with a gaze full of confidence. Seeing Jackson turn his head, Edgar smiled and said, "Is there anything wrong with what I said?" In order to nurture Fang Xinjian, the academy had not been able to make ends meet for the past few months, right? Many medicinal herbs that he had kept for many years were also used up. Now that Fang Xinjian was crippled, wouldn't this be a huge loss? Moreover, the regional selection is going to start in 4 months' time. Yet, there just had to be a lack of cultivation resources at this time. No matter how you look at it, it would be very disadvantageous for the academy's future. Yeah, Fang Xinjian used so many resources, but in the end, he was crippled. What a waste. This lad is too arrogant. When he was privately challenging the other prefectural champions, I already said that he's too undisciplined and undisciplined. Who else would die on the battlefield if not him? Sure enough, he's been crippled now. But you can't say that. After all, Kaunitz was the one who did it. But wasn't he the one who started the trouble? Couldn't he keep a low profile? Previously, he had killed so many gangsters and cursed. I wonder how many aristocrats do not like him. Jackson let out a breath and said, "All right, I indeed have an undeniable responsibility for this matter. I will withdraw a portion of my wealth to make up for the academy's losses. I'm afraid that's not very good, is it? Looking at Jackson's furious glare, Edgar said nonchalantly, "After all, you're old now. It's normal to misjudge people sometimes. Ha ha. Although I'm old, I'm not senile." Jackson sneered. "But I'm afraid you won't be able to help much with just that little bit of wealth of yours." Edgar shook his head and said, "I heard that the Green Jade Academy has raised 50,000 gold coins this time. Mongol Academy also signed an agreement with 17 martial arts sections. As for the Golden Sea Academy, Beaky Academy, Violet Academy, etc., there are a total of 12 regional royal academies in the Great Western region. Other than our cursed, almost all of them have made ample preparations." As he spoke, Edgar got someone to distribute many documents. The documents recorded in detail the various academies' preparations, detailed lists, and various resources. Everyone drew in a long breath when they saw it. Edgar shrugged and said, "And from what I know, until last week, Headmaster Jackson was still helping Fong Xingjian to contact Lord Holy Orison, collecting documents and materials for him to comprehend ether particles." Headmaster, saying this, Edgar's tone turned cold, and he said solemnly, "Have you not given up on Fong Xingjian yet? You're paying so much attention to Fong Xingjian. What position do you place the other students in the academy in?" Jackson felt that each of Edgar's actions and words were like a trap, putting him in a more and more passive position. However, at this moment, he had no choice but to answer honestly, "I believe that Fong Xingjian has a chance. Transitioning into a windstorm sword hero in 4 months and transcending the speed of sound in a month. There are not many people with such aptitude in the history of the Empire. There's a high chance that such a person can sense ether particles and pass heaven's perception. And I'm already in contact with the Holy Orison. They're also very interested in Fong Xingjian's situation. As long as Fong Xingjian can recover, then our initial investments won't be considered a failure. If we were to give up on him now, then all our investments would be for naught." Edgar said angrily, "So you're planning to make the entire academy gamble with you? How many more resources are you going to give him? To a blind person? Has there ever been a blind person in the history of the Empire who became a conferred knight? Has there ever been a blind person who participated in the regional selection? Be more rational, Headmaster. What we should be thinking about now is to cut our losses. If we don't even get into the top 10 in this regional selection, how much would the budget given to us by the regional government and the governor be reduced?" Hearing that the budget would be reduced, everyone present pricked up their ears. This was a real problem that would affect their income, benefits, monthly cultivation resources, and many other things. Edgar said confidently, "The governor is very concerned about this regional selection and next year's national selection. He's also very dissatisfied with how we're giving too many resources to a portion of the talented students. Even the governor has said so. It's true that it's a little unfair to the other students to give us more resources. Governor Devitt was in charge of a region's knights, so there were naturally many leaders under him. The governor was in charge of all 12 prefectural royal academies in the region. As for the one and only prefectural royal academy in the Great Western region, Governor Devitt had always been the headmaster and guided it personally. This was also the only academy that the governor was not in charge of." Hearing Edgar's words, Jackson frowned and said, "Don't worry. I'm only guaranteeing to Fong Xingjian that he will receive the rewards he deserves as the prefectural champion. In the future, we won't be giving him too many resources. But what's the use of giving so many resources to a blind person? In the regional selection, there'll definitely be a stage that tests the comprehension of martial techniques from the Pantheon Monument. He's blind, so how can he observe the Pantheon Monument? There's no way he'll be able to participate in the regional selection." Edgar said, "I suggest that we cancel all the resources given to Fong Xingjian. Of course, this is referring to cultivation resources. The monthly supplements will still be given, and there's no need to take back his house. Although he's blind, he still has his experience. I suggest that we let him be a teacher for the sword and saber department and guide them in their efforts to strive for the regional selection." Jackson let out a cold snort and his aura burst forth, pressing down on Edgar fiercely. Edgar, do you think that you're the one in charge here? That you're the headmaster? Edgar forced a smile and continued. I've already spoken to the people from the Yellowstone Trade Association. They've agreed to sponsor the Academy with 100,000 gold coins, but they only have one request, and that is that I must be the one to use the money. It's because they trust in my judgment, and only then will I use the money properly, bringing glory to the Academy, and not waste it on a blind person. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.